Today's story is about one of the most famous paranormal events in history. But it's not famous because of how outlandish the details are. Instead, it's famous for its credibility. Not only were there 12 witnesses who saw this thing happen, but also there was a NASA engineer who investigated this event and ultimately concluded that it must have happened because of tangible proof. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button's stick deodorant with cream cheese. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around 9 p.m. on December 29, 1980, a 57-year-old woman named Vicki Landrum rode in the front seat of her friend Betty Cash's car, while her 7-year-old grandson, named Colby, who she was raising, sat between them. The three of them had just had dinner at a truck stop and were now on their way home, driving down a dark wooded highway near Huffman, Texas, which is a small town about 30 miles northeast of Houston. As they drove down the road, Vicki began to notice the windshield was fogging up from how cold it was outside and how warm it was inside the car. And so Vicki turned on the defroster. And as the windshield began to clear, Vicki noticed this bright light right out in front of them up over the trees. And at first, Vicki just figured, they were close to the Houston airport, and so that light must just be an airplane. But as the trio continued driving down this winding highway road, that light that Vicki really thought was a plane landing appeared to just kind of hover in the trees. And actually, as they drove, the light almost appeared to get closer and closer to them. So it didn't really seem like it was a plane. Now, at first, Vicki thought this was just kind of interesting and was curious about this light. But as they got closer and closer to this light, it became very obvious that the inside of the car was getting much warmer and stuffier than any of the heat settings would allow it to get, to the point where Vicki was actually sweating and panting from the heat. Now, all of this was happening really quickly, and so Vicki sort of went from being curious to being kind of anxious. Like, what was going on here? Like, does this light have something to do with the heat they're experiencing in the car? And then all of a sudden, the light that appeared to be sort of behind the trees suddenly came right out in front of the car, and Vicki screamed at Betty, "Stop!" And Becky jammed on the brakes, and they came to a stop, and blocking their path, maybe 100 feet in front of them, just hovering over the road, is this strange-looking aircraft aimed right at them. This craft was the strange light. For a moment, all three of them just stared in shock at this craft, like it was so unexpected and so unbelievable that this had happened. But then Vicki, who's sitting there still panting and sweating, she's looking out and she's realizing this craft she's looking at looks nothing like any other aircraft she had ever seen. The craft was a bit bigger than a car, it was diamond-shaped, and it was letting out these strange, loud roaring sounds, almost like an engine. It appeared to be glowing red hot, and periodically, with those loud roaring sounds it was making, fire would appear to shoot out the bottom of the craft, scorching the pavement right under it. And again, this strange craft is just hovering there right over the ground, appeared to be aimed directly at Vicki, Betty, and Colby. Pretty quickly, Colby began to cry. He was scared. But Betty, the driver, she said she couldn't go anywhere. The road was too thin. She couldn't really turn around very easily, and she couldn't drive straight and go under the craft and risk being burned by the flames. And so they were just kind of trapped there. And so Vicki and Betty sort of looked at each other like, okay, we're gonna wait it out and hope this craft just eventually flies away. But after several minutes, and the craft still had not departed, it was still blocking their way and periodically spitting fire into the ground, Vicki and Betty are like, well, let's get out and see what's going on here. Let's investigate. By this point, their fear and anxiety around this had sort of been replaced by just genuine human curiosity. I mean, what the heck is this thing? And so Betty, the driver, she gets out, and Vicki, she tells her grandson, stay in the car, so Colby's right here, and Vicki gets out, and the second she does, and she now has an unobstructed view at this craft, she suddenly remembered this Bible verse. So Vicki was very religious, and she had read in the Bible that one day Jesus would return to the earth, and when he did, he would return in a rain of fire. And so all of a sudden, Vicki believed that what she was looking at was not some aircraft, but the second coming of Jesus Christ. This was like a highly spiritual moment for her. But just as Vicki was about to go forward and actually inspect this thing up close, she heard Colby call out for her. He was crying hysterically. He was totally scared and upset. And so this kind of broke Vicki out of her trance. she turned around and went back to the car to comfort Colby. And when she got back to the car, she found Colby scrunched up on the floor underneath the dashboard like he was trying to shield himself from this craft. And so Vicky, she got right down there with him. She wrapped her arms around Colby and began praying with him to try to calm him down. But while Vicky and Colby were praying inside the car, Betty remained outside of the car, just staring at this craft. And it went on like this for about 10 minutes until Vicky, who's still tucked down there with Colby, heard that roaring sound coming from the aircraft get noticeably louder, like it was about to do something. And so Vicky poked her head up and she looked out the windshield, and sure enough, this craft was beginning to take off. It was getting higher and higher off the ground. Flames were shooting out the bottom of it. Betty was still outside staring at it. And then before long, this craft had shot straight up into the air and began taking off up and away from them at a really steep angle. And at the same time, Vicky suddenly saw this swarm of all these helicopters, these military-style helicopters, go right up around this craft like they were escorting it. And then the craft and all these helicopters took off into the horizon and disappeared. After they were all gone, Vicky realized that what she had just witnessed was not the second coming of Christ. Because of these military helicopters that arrived as this craft took off, it told Vicky and also Betty that very likely this was just a US military exercise of some sort. And so a few moments later, Betty came back to the car and sat in the driver's seat, and Vicky, she climbed back into her seat and lifted Colby up to the middle seat as well. And for a moment, the three of them just sat there in silence. I mean, there's nothing blocking their way anymore. They're just sort of trying to process what just happened. Eventually, Betty just put the car in drive and began driving straight ahead, crossing right over that scorch mark on the pavement where the craft had been. About 45 minutes later, Betty pulled up to Vicky's house and parked the car. Vicky and Colby, they got out, they said goodbye to Betty. They didn't really talk about what they had just seen, they just said goodnight. And then Vicky and Colby headed inside the house. And as much as both of them did have things to say about whatever it was they saw, they just continued not to talk about it. They both were just kind of eager to go to bed. However, as Vicky was putting Colby to bed, he began to complain that his stomach hurt, and at the same time, Vicky began to realize that she also didn't feel very well. And shortly after that, both of them were vomiting in the bathroom. And this scared Vicky. She tried to tell herself that, maybe the reason they were sick is because they ate some bad food at that truck stop. But deep down, Vicky was very concerned that their nausea was somehow connected to that strange craft. And so it was a very long night, with Vicky and Colby being nauseous most of the time, but eventually they both did fall asleep. And then when Vicky got up the next morning, she still felt awful. And so Vicky, she rolled out of bed and made her way to the bathroom. And when she looked at herself in the mirror, she gasped. Her skin was bright red and blistered, like she had had this horrible sunburn. At this point, she knew whatever was going on here, it had to do with that craft. She just knew it. And so Vicky instinctively rushed to Colby's room to check on him to see if his skin was all blistered and red, and she found he was still sleeping, but she could see his skin was red and blistered in some places, but not nearly as bad as Vicky's. And so Vicky, she began thinking about the night before, and she remembered she had gotten out of the car and gotten closer to the craft. So she was sort of more exposed to the craft, if you will, than Colby, who stayed in the car and tucked himself down underneath the dashboard the whole time. And so maybe Vicky's exposure to the craft was higher than Colby's, which is why she looked worse. But as Vicky was thinking this through, she remembered that Betty had actually stayed outside the car for 10-15 minutes, much longer than Vicky had, the whole time just staring directly at this craft. And so immediately Vicky was worried that, if this is what happened to me, I can only imagine what shape Betty is in. And so Vicky ran to the phone, she picked it up and she dialed Betty's number, and she listened, and it just kept on ringing and ringing. Betty didn't answer. Now, at this point, Vicky was in a full-blown panic, not only because she was worried about Betty, but also, she doesn't really know what's wrong with her or with Colby. She doesn't know if their sickness is going to get worse or better. Currently, she felt horrible. She was nauseous. Her skin seemed to be practically falling off. Colby was in less bad shape, but still not healthy. And also, Vicky didn't have the money to even go to the doctor to get looked at. And so as much as Vicky really wanted right now to just go check on Betty, go drive to her house and check on her, she couldn't. She needed to focus on herself and her grandson first and make sure they were okay before she did anything else. And so over the next few days, Vicky and Colby stayed home. They slowly regained their strength. And over those few days, Vicky actually would get Betty on the phone. And Betty would tell her that yes, she's also dealing with similar symptoms, but she was okay, which was very reassuring to Vicky. However, Vicky also knew that Betty was not a complainer, and even if she did have horrendous symptoms, she was not the type of person who would necessarily tell Vicky. She would sort of tough it out. Finally, after 5 days, Vicky felt strong enough to go check on Betty in person. However, when she got to Betty's house and went inside, she called out for Betty, but there was no answer. The house was eerily quiet. And so Vicky began walking around Betty's house looking for Betty. And eventually, Vicky walked down a hallway and reached Betty's bedroom, and the door was shut. Vicky called out for Betty, but there was no answer from inside. And so feeling kind of scared at this point, Vicky reached down, she turned the handle and opened the door, and immediately she saw Betty on her bed. And Betty looked horrible. She was barely conscious. Her entire body was red and blistered and bleeding. There was vomit all over the bed sheets, and there were all these huge clumps of Betty's hair littering her pillow. And so Vicky was horrified. She rushed inside, she scooped her friend up, and between the two of them, they kind of hobbled out of the house. Vicky put Betty in her car, and they sped to the hospital. A few hours later, Vicky was waiting in the emergency room where Betty was being treated when Betty's doctor walked into the waiting room, at which point Vicky stood up and rushed over to him and said, "Hey, what's going on with Betty? What happened to her? What's going on?" But the doctor just shook his head and said, your friend, her skin is literally peeling off her face in sheets, and there are blisters breaking out all over her body. He told Vicky that her symptoms reminded him of radiation poisoning. However, he also told Vicky that that was basically impossible. For Betty, a woman who lives in rural Texas, where would she go to come in contact with something that radioactive? It just seemed not possible, so that couldn't be it. But Vicky, when she heard this, felt like she knew exactly how Betty came in contact with something highly radioactive. It had to be that craft. And so without even thinking about it, Vicky began pouring out the story of how her and Betty had seen this light, and then this craft appeared on the road, and it was shooting fire, and then it flew off with helicopters all around it. But as she was wrapping up her story, Vicky was suddenly overcome with embarrassment because the doctor was now staring at her like she was totally out of her mind. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. As many of you may already know, therapy really changed my life when I got out of the military in 2017. But that change did not happen overnight. It took months before I had any sort of breakthrough, and during those months, it was often pretty uncomfortable for me. It's hard enough just internally thinking about your deepest, darkest issues. And so now imagine, sitting in front of somebody you don't really know, pouring your heart out about these really sensitive things. It was a lot at first. Gradually, the more I showed up and continued working with my therapist, the more I sort of let my ego down and allowed the therapist to do their job. And over time, I really discovered that therapy is a very freeing experience. Being able to speak openly about these things that are troubling you to somebody who is non-judgmental and can offer really distinct feedback and perspective that you just simply can't because you are yourself. You kind of think of yourself one way, but the world sees you another. That was really amazing for me. And so if you're struggling right now and you don't really know what to do about it, consider giving therapy a try. And one very accessible therapy option is BetterHelp. BetterHelp is on a mission to make starting therapy easier. It's entirely online, and all you have to do is fill out a quick questionnaire online, and then you'll be matched with a licensed therapist in as little as 2 days. And if for some reason you don't vibe with your therapist, you don't like them, you can switch therapists as many times as you want at no additional cost. If you're struggling and think you might benefit from a therapy session, click the link in the description below or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen for 10% off your first month of therapy. A month later, in early February of 1981, Vicky was at her kitchen table with the phone pressed to her ear. She was calling her local senator, who she had already written to try to tell him about the strange aircraft she had seen that made her friend sick. But Vicky did not have high hopes about this phone call, because she had already been ignored so many times by so many people when it came to this story. So by this point, Vicky and her grandson Colby had basically recovered from their nausea and their burns. However, Betty had not recovered. She was still cycling in and out of the hospital. She was in constant pain. She still had burns all over her. And in fact, because of all these symptoms, she had to move in with her brother. Now, Vicky was certain that all these symptoms Betty had were radiation sickness caused by the radiation from this aircraft they came in contact with. But it was like everybody they told about this aircraft didn't believe them. Just then, Vicky heard a woman's voice break through the hold music. It was the local senator's secretary. And so Vicky quickly explained why she was calling and why she really wanted to talk to the local senator. But the secretary just told Vicky that, yep, she'll pass this along to the senator and he'll be in touch. And then she hung up. And for Vicky, this was the moment she snapped. She felt like trying to navigate the proper channels to try to figure out what this aircraft was and what happened to Betty was not working, because clearly nobody was taking her seriously. And so Vicky slammed the phone down and just sat there frustrated, having no idea what to do. But as she sat there, Vicky remembered there was actually one place she had not called yet, specifically because she didn't want to call this place. It was a UFO research center. And Vicky hadn't called because she did not believe the craft she had seen was a UFO. She believed it was a military aircraft because she had seen the helicopters escorting it away, and that made the most sense. It had to be military. But if she called the UFO research center and people found out about that, it would make her look even crazier, because now she's claiming the craft was aliens or something. But now Vicky felt like she had run out of options. So she picked up the phone, grabbed the piece of paper with a number on it, and dialed. A couple days later, a scientist named John Schuessler drove down the winding wooded highway into Huffman, Texas. He was going to meet up with Vicky. John was an aerospace engineer for NASA. However, he also spent a lot of time investigating UFO sightings. Vicky's call to that UFO research center had created a lot of excitement in the UFO community, and the story had eventually found its way to John, who decided he would take on the case. Now, to be clear, John was not into researching UFO sightings in order to prove they really happened. Actually, it was sort of the opposite. He would look into reported UFO sightings in order to prove they were not UFOs. He would find a rational, scientific explanation that debunked the sighting. That's sort of what he did. And so with Vicky's case, that was his intention, to go to Huffman, Texas, talk to Vicky, and explain away with science and rationale what happened here. That this was not, aliens. This was something ordinary, like a government aircraft. And so John eventually got to Vicky's house, and he went inside and he chatted with Vicky, and she talked him through all the details of the story. And then eventually they both left Vicky's house, they hopped in their respective cars and headed out to go to the actual site where this had happened. And when they got there and John got out of the car, he didn't need Vicky to direct him to the specific site, because right in front of him was this really obvious black circle right in the middle of the road, as if the road itself had been melted and then re-solidified and actually looked different. And Vicky said, that's where it was. That's where the craft was hovering. Those marks are from the craft. Now, this was great evidence that a craft really had been here, but John wanted more. He needed to figure out what kind of craft this really was. And so he told Vicky he was going to leave and go canvass the area for witnesses, and he told her he would keep her updated. So Vicky left, and John drove up the road until he reached some campsites and farmhouses. And John systematically went from door to door and tent to tent, asking anybody if they had seen or heard any aircraft or anything strange on the night of December 29th. Now, going into this, John didn't really know what to expect from these people he was asking. I mean, he's some random scientist showing up uninvited at people's homes, asking if they've seen strange lights in the sky. However, every single person he spoke to said that yes, they had seen that aircraft on December 29th. However, they were obviously just farther away than Vicky and Betty and Colby had been. So now, John felt like he had enough information to speak directly with military officials. However, when he contacted all the military bases in the area, all those officials he spoke to told him absolutely that on December 29th, there were 0 military operations happening. John found this very frustrating, because to him, it seemed very clear that these officials were just lying to him. But what they were lying about and why was unclear. So John actually went to these military bases to speak to the officials face to face. And when he did, he showed them all the witness testimonies saying what they had seen on December 29th. And he also told them that with his own eyes, he had seen the black scorched mark on the pavement, where the pavement seemed to have literally melted in a ring and re-solidified from the heat of this craft. And to John, I mean, that scorch mark almost proved something had been there, very likely a military craft. But all these military leaders, despite hearing this and hearing John's testimony, they just said, you know what, you can gather up all the evidence you think you have here, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't prove that we were in the area. There was no military craft there that night. And so the bottom line was, the military was adamant they were not involved. And so the case really began to stall. John went home, but he couldn't stop thinking about the case, and so he kept in touch with his witnesses and periodically checked in with military officials, but nothing seemed to change. Except that Betty continued to get sicker and sicker, and Vicky actually began to develop other serious symptoms, like developing cataracts in one of her eyes. And then, John got a frantic call from one of his witnesses. They told him they had just seen something truly incredible. And as John listened to the story, he felt his heart sink, because now he knew the military had been lying to him about being out there on December 29th. Clearly they had been, and very likely it was their aircraft that had made Betty, Vicky, and Colby so sick. But now, John also knew that any hope he had of proving this was now literally gone, because the witness told him that black government vehicles had rolled up to the incident site out on that road, and they'd come along with construction vehicles, and for no clear traffic-related reason, they had cut up one particular stretch of that road, taken it with them, and left. And that particular stretch of road that was removed just happened to be the exact spot where that scorch mark had been left by the craft. It was like they were taking the evidence and getting rid of it. Now, John himself was not able to literally go back to the road and see for himself where the pavement had been cut. However, not long after John learned this information, a group of UFO scientists descended on the road to find this scorch mark, or to prove it had been cut out and taken away like the witness had said. And sure enough, when they got out there, they didn't find the scorch mark. Instead, they found nice, fresh, brand new pavement. The strange event that Vicky, Betty, and Colby experienced on the night of December 29, 1980, is widely considered to be one of the most famous and credible UFO sightings of all time. It's now known as the Cash Landrum incident, after Betty and Vicky's last names, and to this day, nobody has been able to come up with a rational explanation for what happened if it wasn't a UFO. To this day, the US government maintains that they did not have any military operations happening on December 29th. However, they did say when it comes to cutting out the road and paving over it, that was just for routine maintenance. They were not trying to hide evidence. As for Vicky and Betty, over the years, their health continued to deteriorate. They ultimately filed a lawsuit against the government, but because they couldn't actually prove that the aircraft even existed or that it caused their health problems, their lawsuit was ultimately dismissed. Both women would eventually die from cancer, which Colby believes is a direct result from radiation exposure. As for Colby, he's still alive and continuing to seek answers. The official MrBallen podcast YouTube channel is back. This channel is the home for our exclusive MrBallen podcast episodes that you can't get anywhere else on YouTube. Which means if you have not been listening to the MrBallen podcast on podcasting platforms to this point, well, guess what? All those exclusive episodes, all that new content you missed out on is now going to be available to you on YouTube on this channel. And there are literally hundreds of new stories that have only been audio only to this point. And so we're talking about a whole bunch of new content for some of you. We post at least once a week on this channel, so make sure you subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss an episode. Also, to further entice you to check this channel out and hopefully subscribe to it, I have hidden a behind-the-scenes photo of me inside of my studio somewhere on this official MrBallen Podcast YouTube channel. So go over there, subscribe to it, and find that photo. Now, here is a teaser from one of the MrBallen Podcast episodes. Enjoy.
On Wednesday, April 21st, 1 year and 5 days after Bill Harrison had died, 9-year-old Mason Harrison left school at about 3 p.m. and walked home to Pitch Pine Crescent. This was unusual for Mason. Since leaving Nova Scotia and living with his grandmother and father, Mason really couldn't remember a time like today when neither of them had been there after school to get him and Michaela. But since Mason was now old enough to go home on his own, he figured he'd find his grandmother at the house and just remind her that she needed to go out and get his younger sister. And Mason didn't mind. It was a cloudy but mild afternoon, and having this responsibility to walk home made him feel grown up. It was about 3:30 p.m. when Mason finally arrived home. As he walked up the driveway to the front door, he saw his grandmother's car in its usual spot, so he wasn't surprised when he didn't need to use his own key to open the door. Instead, he just walked inside, already slipping the straps of his backpack off his shoulders. But before he could even call out his grandmother's name, Mason suddenly stopped, like he was frozen in place. because there, at the bottom of the carpeted stairs right in front of him, was his grandmother. She was sprawled out on the ground, not moving.
To hear the full episode and so many other strange, dark, and mysterious stories that many of you may not have heard before, head on over to the MrBallen Podcast official YouTube channel. In 1947, a disturbing distress signal was sent out kind of in all directions, like a blind distress signal from some point in the Indian Ocean. Numerous American, Dutch, and English ships, along with other international listening stations, heard this distress signal. And once they triangulated where it was coming from, they sent out a search party to go see who needed help. When they arrived on scene, they discovered something that would become one of the most famous maritime mysteries of all time. This is the story of the SS Orang Medan. What's going on, guys? MrBallen here. I was a Navy SEAL for a little while, and now I tell strange, dark, and mysterious stories on the internet. YouTube is my new passion, and I'm going to be posting at least 2 times a week going forward. And if you like this kind of content, please right now hit like on this video and subscribe to my channel, turn on notifications so you don't miss any of this stuff. Thank you very much. Before we get into the story, I want you guys to be looking at this through the lens of trying to decipher whether or not you believe this really happened, because there is a large percentage of people that say this is just an urban legend. However, there is a couple details that make it really hard to just write off. Number one, you have a number of international ships and listening stations that all reported hearing this same distress signal, and it's a very unique distress signal that we'll get into. In addition, you have the US Coast Guard in one of their, fairly credible publications published a story about this case 5 years after it happened. And then you have the fact that this case has been around since 1947, it's been 70 plus years, and no one's officially debunked it. So let's dive in. In 1947, several Dutch, American, and English ships, along with a number of listening stations, picked up the strange distress signal that was coming from somewhere in the Indian Ocean. The distress signal, which was in Morse code, went like this.
An officer, including the captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge, possibly whole crew dead.
Then there was a burst of indecipherable Morse code, and then it ended with 2 words.
I die.
Then silence. One ship that heard this distress signal was the Silver Star. It was an American vessel that was kind of patrolling the waterways around the coast of Malaysia, and with the help of other ships in and around the Indian Ocean and some of the listening stations, they were able to triangulate the location of this distress signal. And they pinpointed a ship called the SS Orang Medan that was located right at the end of the Strait of Malacca, which is the primary shipping lane between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And so this ship was basically drifting out towards the Indian Ocean. And so the first thing that the Silver Star does is they try to send a message back to the Orang Medan. But after numerous failed attempts, the captain of the Silver Star decides that we need to go investigate because something is obviously not right here. So the Silver Star tells all the other ships in the area, along with the other listening stations, that they are going to be the search party. They're going to reroute and head for the Orang Medan, because at this point, anybody that had heard that signal is saying, like, what do we do? Like, are we going to go investigate? Are you? After a couple of hours of heading straight for the Orang Medan, they see off in the distance the ship. From the eyes of these very experienced sailors on the Silver Star, they knew almost immediately that this ship is dead in the water. It's just drifting, which is not a good sign, especially if you combine that with the signal they got. As they get closer and closer to this ship, it becomes creepier and creepier because they're looking up, and in the bridge where the steering wheel would be, they can't make any person out. There's no one up there. There's nobody standing on the edge. I mean, they just sent this distress signal. You would think with a ship that's dead in the water that they would be lining the outside of the ship trying to signal someone down. But no, it's just quiet. No one on board, all lights off, just drifting, bobbing in the choppy waters of the Indian Ocean. And so as they get closer, they start blowing their whistle to try to attract anybody on the Orang Medan to signal them back. They're also doing more Morse code to try to get their attention again, not being picked up. And so finally, after all these failed attempts and just the general weirdness around it, the captain of the Silver Star decides, we need to board this ship. So these Silver Star crew members, they knew before they boarded that almost definitely they were going to find something terribly wrong with this ship. There's just too many red flags about it. They were anticipating something bad, but I don't think that they were really prepared for just how bad this was going to be. So they board the ship, and right away on deck is a number of crew members that had passed away, or all deceased. And the mystery really kicks in the position, the body position of all of the dead crew members. They were all on their back with their hands outstretched in front of them, as if defending themselves from some unseen assailant above them. Even strangers, they had this look of abject terror on their face, as if the final moments before they died were just excruciatingly painful and terrifying. Even the dog was in a position with its teeth bared. It looked like it was growling up into the sky. All of them. And so obviously the Silver Star crew members are, shocked at what they find. And they're kind of looking at each of these dead crew members and they're like, what is going on? So they make their way up to the bridge, and everybody's also dead in the same position, basically fighting with some unseen assailant in their final moments before they pass. The person who had been sending out the distress signal had literally slouched over the telegraph. Like their finger was literally on the telegraph. He's the only one that was not doing this. He was on the telegraph and had passed away in that position. So they go down into the bowels of the ship. Normally, inside of a steel ship in the boiler room, it's going to be pretty hot. There's no real ventilation to speak of. Not to mention outside, it was over 100 degrees. They went down into the boiler room and down into the ship, and it was strikingly cold. Some of the crew members from the Silver Star said it felt like it might have been about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. They found more crew members also passed away, also fighting with something in the air, with that look of abject terror on their face. So all of the crew has perished in this very bizarre way. There was no overt damage to the ship. It just appeared that the engine had been turned off, but ultimately the ship had no real damage to it at all. They couldn't find anything. The crew, despite meeting a fairly unfortunate end, also had no signs of outside injury, external injury. Something had obviously caused them all to perish, but there was no injuries outside their body. In addition, all of them showed signs of rapidly decomposing. Considering they had just been tapping away that distress signal hours earlier, unless the person communicating the distress signal had been the last one alive for a long time, it doesn't really add up that they had decomposed as quickly as they had relative to when this distress signal was sent. So the captain of the Silver Star, taking into account all of the strangeness, decides not to touch any of the bodies, leave them where they are, get off the ship, tie a tow line to the Orang Medan, and tow it in. We're going to have experts look at this and figure out what happened. And so they attach the tow line, the crew members of the Silver Star, and as soon as they begin to move it, they notice, the crew of the Silver Star, that smoke has begun billowing out of the inside of the Orang Medan. And so, not taking any chances, they cut the tow line and they literally jump back onto the Silver Star right as the Orang Medan explodes. In fact, there was a quote which basically said it exploded with so much force that it was lifted out of the water entirely and then splashed back down and rapidly sank. So now you have no evidence. You have the testimony of the people that were on the ship, but other than that, you have no evidence. The ship is now gone. The captain of the Silver Star and his crew just have to go back to the mainland to try to make sense of what they just saw, because you have all these people that were involved and want to know what happened, and they're like, well, let me tell you, we saw this horrible thing on board and then it exploded and it disappeared. And so that's where the mystery kind of ends. But here we go. Let's get into what the primary critique is, because that's important to hear too, and then we'll hear the rebuttal, which I think is also pretty important. So people that believe this story is just a legend will point to the fact that there really isn't a good record of the SS Orang Medan ever existing. There's this one very important publication called Lloyd's Shipping Registers, where you would expect the Orang Medan to be registered, but they're not. Others will say that, well, Orang Medan translates to man of Medan, and Medan is near Sumatra, and that's where they were registered. So they weren't in Lloyd's Shipping Registers, they were in another registry. But either way, there is contention around whether or not this ship ever existed. But for those who say that this could be true, they say that, well, there's a good reason why those records don't exist, because someone's trying to cover it up. According to a German researcher who had spent decades covering the Orang Medan case, he published in the Death Ship on the South Seas, it's a publication from 1953, that the Orang Medan was transporting illegal materials, things like nitroglycerin and potassium cyanide. These are things used to create weapons. And there might have been a leak that led to the death of everyone on board. No physical injuries, but they passed away. And then also, after they tied that tow line, the materials could have detonated. Perhaps they detonated, that kind of thing. And so that still leads some questions, right? I mean, then how did the Silver Star crew not also get exposed to these chemicals as soon as they got there? Either way, it's a fascinating story, and I hope that you took something from it. So if you haven't already, I would really appreciate it if you liked this video and you hit subscribe on my channel. I will be posting at least 2 times a week going forward, content just like this, so I hope you'll join, and that's gonna do it, guys. Thank you. Today, I'm going to share with you 3 progressively more horrifying true stories, and at the end of each of them, I'm going to share with you the picture that is famously associated with them. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all I do, and I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, then please remove 1 puzzle piece from all of the like button's puzzles. Also subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 1909, Ioana Constantinescu was a 27-year-old woman living in the Romanian city of Timișoara. Ioana was a devout practitioner of Zoroastrianism, which is one of the world's oldest organized religions that began in ancient Persia and is now practiced primarily in East Asia. In the city that Ioana was living in, it was majority Christian, and they looked at Zoroastrians as witches. As such, Ioana was persecuted and ostracized primarily by these 2 Christian ministers that spread a rumor that she was drinking the blood of local children and that she worshipped Satan. That rumor would spread and grow to the point where everybody knew Ioana as like the singular witch of all the Zoroastrians in the city, and it ultimately incited this angry Christian mob to storm her house on October 21st, 1909, and rip her into the streets and savagely beat her to within an inch of her life. She would survive this lynching, and she would be taken to a hospital where she'd be treated for severe blunt force injuries and lacerations. But after 2 days of being in the hospital, when she had not made a full recovery at all, she checked herself out and headed home. The next day, Ioana was found dead in her apartment, and her family and friends initially believed that she had died as a result of the injuries she had sustained from the angry mob, and that perhaps she had checked herself out of the hospital too soon, and untreated, that's why she must have passed away early. But when the authorities arrived at her house and began looking at the scene, it did not look like she had died as a result of those injuries. It looked more like some sort of ritual suicide. She was laying on this sofa with her arms over her chest. Next to the sofa was an altar that was adorned with strange occult symbols and ritual herbs and effigies, and on the altar was this goblet with deep, dark red stains on the inside. When they looked at Ioana, even though she was fully dressed, underneath her sleeves were all these cuts on her arms, and there were cuts on her legs as well. After her autopsy, the medical examiner said she had died from a combination of blood loss and internal shock from ingesting massive quantities of blood that triggered cardiac arrest. Ioana had been draining her own blood into the sacramental goblet, drinking it, and then doing it over and over again until she died. Locals believed that that was not just a ritual suicide, but rather she was placing a curse on her enemies. Almost immediately following her death, those 2 Christian ministers that had spread those rumors about her that led to the mob coming and attacking her, they both died of an extremely rare blood-borne illness. And then immediately following their demise, the two primary vigilantes that actually organized that mob that would attack Loana, they both died. One was hit by a falling tree and another died in a fire. And according to more recent accounts, Loana's curse didn't end with the death of her tormentors. There have been dozens of reports of people after seeing this image, which is of Loana after she was discovered by authorities in her home, that they will have bouts of extreme sleep paralysis. These are people that have never had sleep paralysis before, that this picture somehow induces sleep paralysis in them, like they're cursed by Loana. And so now that you've seen this image, you're cursed too. So you're welcome. In 1876, Blanche Monnier was a beautiful 25-year-old from a very wealthy, prominent family in Paris who desperately wanted to find a husband and move out of her mother's home and start her own life. The man she would fall in love with was not a young, rich aristocrat like her family was hoping, but instead was an older, poor lawyer. Her mother told her that she needed to break off this relationship and find a more suitable suitor. But Blanche refused and said she was in love with this man. When her mother outright forbid her from seeing this man ever again, she refused and began sneaking out at night to spend time with this guy and was away from the home quite a bit, just kind of escaping her mom. But during this tumultuous time where Blanche is very much at odds with her mother, Blanche would unexpectedly die. And since this is the late 1800s, people did that at a young age. They just unexpectedly died. And so her lover and her family and society mourned her loss, but ultimately time went on and people moved on. 25 years later, in 1901, French police received this strange handwritten letter that just basically states that the Monnier family has a very dirty secret and you should go check their estate out. Now, the Monnier family was in excellent standing in Paris. I mean, they were one of the more prominent families. The mother, she was known for her charitable works. They were just one of those families that everybody knew, including certainly the French police. And so when they got this letter, they weren't actually that concerned that there was any truth to this letter, but they felt like it was their duty to at least go knock on the Monnier family's door, show them the letter, and then just take a look around. And so they did that. They showed up. They showed the Monnier family, including her mother who was at the door, hey, we have this letter. Would you mind if we looked around? The Monnier family was very cooperative. They let them walk around their whole big estate, and the police didn't find anything. As they're chatting in the doorway, getting ready to leave, because this is all just a big misunderstanding, one of the officers turns and looks up a little flight of stairs that they hadn't gone up and notices a small door that's been padlocked shut, and it's the only door at the end of this one stairwell. And he says off the cuff to the family, well, what's in that door up there? And Blanche's mother says, oh, that's a supply closet. You know, our assistants come in and they'll go in there and use that. And the French police officers say, well, would you mind if we just poked our heads in? It's the only space we haven't checked. And since we're already here, we'll just check that box. We'll go in there and poke our heads in. At this point, the Monnier family says, no, we're not going to let you go in there because you don't need to. It's just the supply closet. Now the police say, you're going to go ahead and open up that door. At which point the family says, no, we're not. So one of the officers tells the family to stay right here, while the other officer goes up the stairs to try to break open this lock and see what's in there. As soon as he's right outside the door, he's hit with this overwhelmingly disgusting smell. It smells like rotting flesh. It smells like death. He covers his mouth and he breaks open the lock and he opens the door, and there in the middle of this dark, disgusting smelling room on a rotting straw mattress is none other than Blanche Monnier. 25 years later, she is alive, she barely weighs 55 pounds, and she's chained to a bed. She has not come out of those chains or moved off of that bed in 25 years. The smell was so bad that could barely be in there for longer than a few minutes at a time. But one of the officers immediately goes over and knocks down some of the wood that was blocking up the windows, and sunlight pours into the room, and it's the first time Blanche Monnier is seeing sunlight in 25 years. The reason she had been imprisoned in this room is because 25 years earlier, when she was fighting with her mother about not seeing this poor commoner, and she wasn't willing to break off the relationship with him, her mother told her to go in this room and said, you can't come out until you tell me you're going to break it off with this guy. She was so in love with him that she said no, and her mother wouldn't let her leave. And then days turned into months, turned into years, turned into decades, and here we are 25 years later, and she had never left that room. The mother and the brother of Blanche Monnier were arrested, and the public found out about this. And it incited a huge mob that went to their house. And it actually caused Blanche Monnier's mother to have a heart attack, and she would end up dying only a couple of days later. And so she never had to serve any jail time or really answer to any of her crimes. And the brother was complicit in what was happening to Blanche Monnier, but he kind of weaseled his way out of it. As for Blanche Monnier, she was remarkably lucid when she came out of that room. And she commented on how lovely it was to breathe fresh air and to be in sunlight. She was brought to a hospital where she did make a recovery, but she was so screwed up from being in that room that she didn't really know how to function in society anymore. And so she was moved to a mental institution, and unfortunately, she died about 10 years later. On October 13th, 1972, Uruguayan Flight 571 was flying from Uruguay to Chile for a rugby game. On board were 45 people. There was 5 pilots and crew. The other 40 were the rugby team and their friends and relatives. So they take off and they're making their way to Chile, and the pilot was relatively inexperienced and he made a fatal mistake. He believed it was time to make their descent into Chile, but he was actually about 70 kilometers early. So as he's descending through the clouds, he believes he's going to see a runway and land this plane. Instead, he sees the Andes Mountains, and it's too late to pull up out of the way. He basically nicked the mountain, causing the plane to start tumbling down at breakneck speeds, 350 kilometers per hour. As it's tumbling down the mountain, the tail breaks off and 7 people are sucked out immediately that all perish. It's blazing down this mountain, and then it comes to a crashing stop where on impact it kills the 2 pilots. But miraculously, of the 45 people on board, 33 were still alive when all the dust settled. But that night, 5 more people would perish from the freezing temperatures, and within a couple days of this crash landing, another person would die. Those who were still alive that weren't in a coma or critically injured used luggage and debris from the plane and seats to create shelter, and they actually started pulling out lipstick from inside of some of the passengers' luggage, and they tried to write SOS on the outside of the plane because the fuselage was still pretty clearly intact. But they didn't have enough lipstick, they didn't have any medical supplies, and they didn't have proper clothing for the temperatures they were in. They did not anticipate being in minus 30 degrees Celsius temperatures for extended periods of time. They also had very, very little food, and it was running out very quickly. In a very cruel twist of fate, they actually found a working radio that allowed them to tune in and listen to the media as they tried to find them. And so they had to listen in horror after about a week when the search was called off, because no one knew where they were, and the assumption was they must have all died in the crash. When the food finally ran out, survivors began eating the seats inside the plane, the leather and the cotton. But as they're doing this, they know what the next step has to be if they're going to survive. They need to eat the dead. And so on day 9 of the ordeal, the survivors ate the pilots. And they chose the pilots because they were the only people amongst the dead that they didn't personally know. The rest of the dead that they would ultimately eat were their friends and loved ones. Now, naturally, these people did not want to become cannibals, but virtually everyone, out of a need to survive, was able to make the adjustment. There were some people that couldn't, including one woman who didn't eat and ultimately died of starvation on day 60 because she just was not prepared to do what was necessary to survive. As if this situation wasn't bad enough, an avalanche would eventually strike the landing site, killing 8 more of these people that are doing everything they can to survive. But at the time of the avalanche, their food source had effectively run out, and so those 8 people who perished in the avalanche ultimately replenished their food source. From day 1, the survivors discussed climbing up and over the mountains and walking towards Chile to try to search for help. But the attempts so far had all failed due to extreme cold, malnutrition, altitude sickness. It was like they knew as soon as they walked over that mountain, they were going to die. And so many of them decided early on that they would rather just stay with the group because at least that way they would die as a group, or maybe by some stroke of luck they could still be discovered and they might be easier to discover as a big group. But 2 months after the crash, and with no help in sight, they know the search has been called off. 2 of the survivors basically say, screw it. I'm gonna make the trek over the Andes Mountains. We have no supplies, we have nothing, no map, no compass, no anything. We're just gonna walk roughly in the direction of Chile, and you know what? We're either gonna die here or we're gonna die out there. and so the two take off. They somehow survived for 9 days, walking over the Andes Mountains with no equipment. They've been out for 60 plus days at this point, and they managed to walk into this valley, and they see that there are people living in this valley. There's actually a couple of fishermen right on the other side of this river. And so they go down to the edge of the river and they're yelling out to these people on the other side. The fishermen couldn't make out what they were saying. And so the fishermen, they got a piece of paper and they put a pencil in it and balled it up with a rock and threw it across the river. And they were able to write down that they had survived a plane crash. They were located back in that direction. There was 14 other survivors and they desperately needed help. Balled it up, threw it back. 3 Chilean helicopters were spun up and sent off in their direction, and the 14 other survivors were able to be picked up, brought to safety, and all 16 would make a full physical recovery. However, the most difficult thing they would ever have to recover from was becoming reluctant cannibals, which is something that haunts all of them to this day. And here is the famous final picture of inside Uruguayan Flight 571 just moments before they crashed into the Andes Mountain and had to go through that horrific 72-day ordeal. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of these 3 stories, and I will get back to all the early commenters, and I'll pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please take 1 puzzle piece from all of the like button's puzzles. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my handle is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. I look at it every day, and if I intentionally use one of your suggestions, I will absolutely credit you. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I'm incredibly appreciative of your support. And until next time, that's going to do it, guys. See ya. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And today I'm going to share 2 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button leaves their phone out unattended, go ahead and pick it up and spam passwords over and over again until it locks them out of their phone for a week. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At around 8 p.m. on December 16, 2023, a 31-year-old man named Nestor Flores was driving down a highway just outside of Dallas, Texas, with both his hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. Nestor was very stressed out on this ride. All he wanted to do was get home because he was worried that on this ride, he might get pulled over by police. I mean, this was a route he had driven a bunch, and he knew there were loads of state troopers that patrolled the area. And from his perspective, it seemed like they kind of pulled people over all the time. And Nestor had spent the night out with a couple of friends, and he had had a couple of drinks. You know, he didn't feel he had had too much to where he couldn't drive, but he knew if he did get pulled over, you know, he could be in trouble. And then on top of that, you know, in the back of Nestor's mind was the fact that he had had a couple of minor run-ins with the law over the past couple of years. And so he kind of had this fear of police already. And also, Nestor was not born in America. And so he was worried that on top of all that, if he got pulled over, you know, he could risk being deported. And so on whole, Nestor just does not want to see any police officer. He just wants to get home and go to bed. And so as Nestor is doing his best to not draw any suspicion to himself and is trying to follow all the rules of the road, he decides to have a sip of his Diet Coke. And his Diet Coke was right in the middle console. And so as he's driving eyes straight ahead, he reaches down and he grabs the Coke, he pulls it up, he uncaps it, takes a sip. But then as he puts the drink back down, again, he's keeping his eyes on the road, he hits something with the drink. And he feels the drink slosh out of his cup and it hits his hand. And instinctively, you know, he took his eyes off the road and looked down at the Coke, and he managed to put the drink back in its cup holder. And then when he brought his eyes back to the road, there was a deer in the middle of the road. He was too close to swerve out of the way. And so at full speed, he smashes into this deer. The deer hits his front windshield and basically caves in the passenger side windshield and flips up and over the back of his car. And Nestor, amazingly, was composed enough to not swerve wildly post-impact, because he knew if he did that, he could run into oncoming traffic or something. And so he just kept on going straight and gradually slowed down and pulled off the side of the road. And as he did, he looked over his shoulder, seeing if this deer was basically lying in the road, or even worse, maybe it hit some other car. But when he looked over his shoulder, the road was clear. There was no deer. Now, even though Nestor was obviously very shaken up at this point, I mean, he just had this horrible car accident with this deer, and he's already on edge about getting pulled over by police. But for the moment, it was just peaceful on the highway. No cops were coming up to him, and he's pulled over to the side. Physically, he was okay. It seemed like the deer was okay. It clearly ran off the road or something. And there was damage to his car. I mean, the deer really smashed in the front of his car, and the windshield, especially on the passenger side, was basically caved in. But Nestor was able to see through his side of the windshield, and when he put the car back in drive and hit the gas, the car seemed to drive just fine. And so even though Nestor felt kind of bad that he had smashed this deer, he thought, what am I going to do? Go find the deer and make sure it's okay? Like, he can't really do anything. It's nighttime. And so he made the decision that, nobody saw this, and it seems like everything's okay, so I'm just going to drive home, and I'll take care of my car tomorrow. But after driving 38 more miles from the impact site, Nestor's car began making this horrible rattling sound from the engine, and also smoke began to billow up out of the front of his car. And so Nestor knew, this is so conspicuous, he's gonna get pulled over if he doesn't stop. And so feeling really annoyed, because he was actually pretty close to home at this point, Nestor pulled off the highway and came to a stop in a parking lot of a fast food restaurant. And so at first, all Nestor did was just turn off his car and wait for a couple of minutes in hopes that, that would be enough to cure his car. But after a couple of minutes, the smoke continued to billow out of his car, and then when he tried to turn it back on again, the car simply wouldn't start. And so at this point, Nestor knew he had to call a tow truck. But when he reached for his phone was dead, and he didn't have a phone charger in his car, and so he's like, great, I can't even call a tow truck. But then he looked up and saw the fast food restaurant was open, and he decided he would just go in there, and he would ask one of them if they had a charger. So Nestor gets out of his smoking car, he walks into the restaurant, he goes up to the counter, and he asks the person behind the counter, like, hey, my phone's dead, do you have a charger? Do you mind charging my phone? But the employee, they didn't say anything back to Nestor. They just stood there with their mouths open and their eyes wide, staring at Nestor, like they couldn't believe what they were looking at. And so Nestor's thinking, like, what's wrong with this person? Hey, do you have a charger or not? And the employee, who by this point is pale as a ghost, just shook their head at Nestor, like, no, they don't have a charger. And then they just stood there, still staring at Nestor. And so now Nestor is genuinely just furious. I mean, the whole night has completely derailed here. All he wanted to do was get home, and it's like one horrible thing happens after another. And so Nestor was just like, okay, fine. And he turned around and he left the restaurant and went back to his car, thinking maybe if I search the whole vehicle, there's bound to be a charger in there somewhere. And so Nestor gets back into his car, he climbs into the driver's seat, he shuts the door, and as he begins looking around his car for this charger, he begins to feel really sleepy. And actually, he eventually just kind of leans forward and falls asleep in his car. More than 2 hours later, Nestor woke up to the sound of somebody tapping on his window. And so Nestor groggily turned and looked, and it was like the worst case scenario. It was a police officer who was shining his flashlight into the vehicle, clearly gesturing for Nestor to roll his window down. And so Nestor was totally compliant. He rolled the window down and he looked at the officer. And before Nestor could even say anything, the officer said, get out of the car. So Nestor, he gets out of the car and he's thinking to himself, why is he acting so aggressively towards me? Like, what have I done here? And so Nestor, he gets out of the car. And again, before Nestor can ask any questions, the officer just says to Nestor, what happened tonight? Like, what's going on here? And so Nestor, he knows his car is jacked up and here he is sleeping in the parking lot. And so he turns to the officer and begins explaining the deer story. He was driving down the road, he hits this deer, it went over the top, he didn't see it, he didn't report it. And as he's telling the officer this, he's thinking, oh my gosh, like, is there a law? Like, if you hit a deer, are you supposed to report it? Is that what's going on? Maybe the deer did die and it was in the middle of the road and somebody saw his license plate and now the cop was here. And so Nestor began to panic, trying to explain the logic behind leaving the deer and how sorry he was, he should have stopped, he should have called the police. But the officer finally just put up his hand, telling Nestor to stop talking, and then the officer took his flashlight and he shined it past Nestor at his car. And when the officer did that, the officer immediately grabbed his radio and began barking orders into it, saying he needed backup. And so Nestor's like, what is going on here? Like, this whole night has been such a disaster. Like, what did I do? And so Nestor, he turned to see what the cop was looking at on his car that would elicit such a big response from him. And when he looked at the passenger seat of his car, where the cop's light was now shining, Nestor froze for a second and then just started to scream. It would turn out that even though Nestor believed he had only had, a few drinks and he was okay to drive, the reality was he was completely annihilated drunk and should never have been behind the wheel. And when he was driving on the highway, anxiously trying to get home, well, he didn't hit a deer. He hit a 45-year-old pedestrian named Terry Ivory, and he hit this guy with so much force that Terry went through the windshield on the passenger side and then landed in the passenger seat, minus one leg, which had been severed on impact. And then Terry's dead body sat there in the passenger seat with Nestor having no idea. He thinks there's a deer back there, but there was never a deer. There's just a dead guy next to him. And Nestor just drove 40 more miles with Terry's dead body next to him. And then when Nestor's car began to smoke and make noises, he pulled off the highway to that fast food restaurant parking lot. And then when he went inside the restaurant to try to get a phone charger, the reason that employee was so shocked to see Nestor and could basically not even speak when Nestor was trying to talk to them was because Nestor was covered practically head to toe in blood, Terry's blood. Now, it's not entirely clear why that employee did not immediately call police, but, after Nestor left the restaurant, went back to his car, and fell asleep, during the time Nestor was sleeping, someone inside the restaurant did call the police, and that's why they showed up and knocked on Nestor's glass. Nestor was charged with collision involving death in December of 2023. However, his case has not yet been adjudicated. Earlier this year, we announced our very first MrBallen book, a graphic novel. And the release date is fast approaching. It's coming out on October 1st, which also happens to be my birthday. Now, this graphic novel was truly a labor of love. It took us well over a year to put this thing together, and I'm telling you, it's fantastic. There are 4 brand new feature-length stories that I have never told on any of our platforms, so 4 new, and then 5 OG, classic MrBallen stories that have been re-edited and reformatted to fit the graphic novel. So, if you haven't done this already, go to book.ballenstudios.com to pre-order a copy of this amazing graphic novel so you can get it the moment it comes out, which again is in just a few weeks on October 1st. And if you're a fan of hearing my voice tell you stories, you're in luck, because I just finished recording the audiobook version of the graphic novel, and I promise you it is not just me, reading the book on tape. It's not that. I actually went wildly off script for every story, spicing them up a bit, to the point where the director was a little bit concerned that I had gone so rogue during this audiobook. But I'm telling you, it wound up making the audiobook really unique. It's basically like its own thing now, and it's a great companion to the graphic novel because it's not just the words. It's like an expansion of what you're seeing on the page. So the audiobook, it's pretty good. So again, if you want a copy of the novel or the audiobook or both, just go to book.ballenstudios.com. Okay, back to the stories. On the afternoon of December 15th, 1997, a brand new mother named Luz Cuevas sat on her couch in her little apartment in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, cradling her beautiful 10-day-old baby girl, who she had named Delamar Vera. And in the room with Luz and her daughter were some members of Luz's extended family who had come over to meet the baby. And so for about an hour, the family all took turns, holding the baby and complimenting how cute her little dimples looked. And then eventually the baby started to get fussy, at which point Luz said she was going to take her upstairs and put her to bed. And so Luz brought Delamar upstairs to her nursery, and she put the baby down in her crib, and she stayed with her for a bit until Delamar finally had kind of dozed off to sleep. And so after being sure that her daughter wasn't going to stir, Luz got up and she began making her way towards the door, and right before she left, she made sure to plug in the space heater for her daughter's room to make sure it would stay warm enough while her daughter slept. And then after that, she left the room, shut the nursery door, and went back downstairs to rejoin her family. Luz's family didn't stick around much longer after Luz came downstairs, and after they were all gone, Luz realized she was totally exhausted and her daughter was still fast asleep upstairs, and so Luz decided she would also lie down and try to take a nap herself. But as soon as she closed her eyes, she heard this loud thud sound coming from the second floor. And it sounded like something really heavy had smashed into the ground. And she's thinking, her daughter's up there. Could that be her daughter somehow falling out of the crib or something? And so Luce jumped up, sprinted upstairs, and as she looked down the hall, she could clearly see there was black smoke billowing out of her daughter's nursery. And so Luce charges down the hall, she opens up the door, and she looks into her daughter's room, and it's completely engulfed in flames. I mean, everything is on fire, but it's her baby girl in there. And so without any hesitation, Luce charges into the inferno. But when she gets up to the crib, the crib is so completely on fire that when she looks in, she can't even see her daughter. And so in a craze, she begins looking around the room thinking maybe my daughter did fall out of the crib and she's somewhere else in the room, but everything is on fire. She can't see anything. And so as Luce is literally catching on fire and breathing in all the smoke, she's screaming for her daughter. And then a couple of minutes later, firefighters burst into the door and they literally drag Luce out of the nursery. She hasn't found her daughter. She's screaming, where's my baby? But the firefighters, they bring her outside. And just a couple of minutes later, they were able to extinguish this blaze. And after they came out of the house again, they found Luce, who had all these terrible burns in her body, and she's totally messed up from this fire. And they tell her that unfortunately, her daughter was dead. After Delamar's death, Luce's life completely fell apart. I mean, the grief was so immense. It was like she could no longer function in society. I mean, she actually retracted from the world, stopped interacting with people, didn't see her family. She wound up getting a divorce from her husband just over the grief and the sadness of losing this child. I mean, it was like her life basically ended when her daughter's life ended. But on top of that, Luce also felt this incredible sense of guilt because after the fire, the investigators told her that the cause of the fire, although not conclusive, was very likely from that space heater she had plugged in right before she had left the room. And so, of course, Luce is feeling this incredible burden for having potentially killed her daughter, but also she just began to obsess over the details because, again, it wasn't conclusive that it was the space heater. That was their best guess as to what caused the fire. And so Luce began to wonder, was it something else? Was it preventable? What was it? Basically, Luce became completely obsessed with what happened to her daughter. It was like the only thing she ever thought of for years. Fast forward to January 24th, 2004, so 6 years after the fire. And on this day, Luce was invited to a family party. There was a get-together, and, Luce basically never went to any family function or really left her house much at all. But for some reason, on this day, she decided to go out. And so she goes to this party, and when she gets there, remember, Luce has basically been a recluse for the past 6 years. And so she's not going to immediately start socializing. And so instead, she just goes in the house and kind of finds a spot in the back, kind of away from everybody else who's chatting, and just stands there, kind of people watching. And as she's doing that, something catches her attention off to the side. And when she turns to look at it and sees what it is, she immediately just freezes. 3 days later, Luce walked into the office of a local state legislator, and after saying hello, she sat down, reached into her purse, and pulled out a little plastic bag that contained a folded-up napkin. And she slid it across the table to the legislator. And so he picked up the bag and stared at it inquisitively as Luce dove into this wild explanation about what was in this bag and why she was here. And at the end of this totally off-the-wall, insane-sounding story, the legislator was left just kind of staring at Luce and looking back at the bag in total shock. And then finally, after a couple of moments of silence, the legislator just said, "Okay, yeah, I'll see what I can do." It would turn out the fire was not caused by the space heater that Luce had plugged in right before she left her daughter's room. Instead, police believe after Luce came downstairs and tried to take a nap, somebody broke into her apartment, went into the nursery, and set the fire on purpose, but not before abducting the baby. And that person was one of Luce's own family members who had been at her apartment that day celebrating the birth of Delamar Vera. It was Luce's husband's cousin, Carolyn Correa. And in fact, on this same day, before the fire and before the abduction, Carolyn made a point to announce to the whole family that she was pregnant, even though she wasn't. It was just going to be her cover story for why she suddenly had this brand new baby. 6 years later, when Luce was at that family party, well, the thing that caught her attention on the other side of the room was her daughter. She literally saw her daughter, and even though she hadn't seen her in 6 years, she instantly knew it was her because of her distinctive dimples. Now, Luce knew she couldn't just suddenly yell out, "That's my daughter!" So instead, she came up with this plan. She walked up to the girl and very discreetly said, "Hey, honey, I think you got some gum in your hair." And so as she pretended to pull gum out of the child's hair, she carefully plucked a few strands and put them inside of a napkin and put it inside of her pocket. And then 3 days later, she brought that hair inside of that plastic baggie and she gave it to the legislator and basically said, "Here's what I think happened. I think she stole my kid. Can you test it for DNA to prove that girl is my daughter?" And the legislator was like, "Okay, I'll give it a shot." And lo and behold, that hair would prove that girl at the party was her daughter. She did not die in that fire. Carolyn Correa was sentenced to 9 to 30 years in prison for abduction. She originally had an arson charge against her as well, but investigators could not actually prove how the fire started, and so they ultimately dropped those charges. Officials also launched an inquiry into how the fire department had handled the original investigation, because Luce had tried to convince fire officials that, maybe her daughter had not died in the blaze, maybe she was just missing, because when Luce went into the nursery, she claimed she couldn't even find her daughter, but investigators had told her that the fire had burned so hot that basically her daughter had been totally incinerated, and that's why she couldn't find her. In the end, though, because of her refusal to ever give up, Luce was ultimately reunited with her daughter, Delamar. Okay, so if you're not listening to our show called Run Fool, then you are really missing out on a truly special and unique podcast. Now, it's technically a horror podcast, but honestly, it's so much more. Every episode is a fresh take on terrifying lore, like a modern ghost story wrapped up in a tightly spun narrative. Also, remember, Run Fool is a Ballen Studios podcast, which means there's always going to be a big plot twist or reveal at the end. Rodney Barnes is the iconic host of Run Fool, and every story he tells on there, it feels like this fully immersive horror movie. Also, the sound design on this show is like expert level. Barnes really knows what he's doing. Even if you never watch the show, you should tune in just for a second, at least once, just to hear Barnes's radio voice. It is like the best, most soothing voice I think I've ever heard. So if Run Fool feels like a show you might like, go run and follow the show and start listening. So that's going to do it. If you want more strange, dark, and mysterious content, remember we have a whole slew of podcasts under the Ballen Studios umbrella. They are the MrBallen podcast, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Run Fool, Bedtime Stories, and Wartime Stories. All of them are free. There are loads of episodes, and they are all of the strange, dark, and mysterious variety. All you have to do is go to any podcast platform, look up Ballen Studios, and boom, there are all of our podcasts for you to go binge. Thank you very much. Until next time, see ya. What's going on, guys? MrBallen here, former Navy SEAL turned internet storyteller with a focus on the strange, dark, and mysterious. And speaking of mysterious, today I have a mystery for you, and it's one of the more recent mysteries. It happened in 2014 and spanned a couple of years following that. It is a story that plays out like a psychological thriller, and in fact, Netflix recently purchased the rights to make a movie or show about this case from the family that were the victims of this case. The too long didn't read version of this story is you have this all-American family that purchases their dream home. They're getting ready to move in, and they start receiving these awful, wrathful, threatening letters from some anonymous person or group. The letters get progressively worse and indicate that whoever is watching them very closely at all hours and is able to see things that are not easy to spot just from walking by. This is someone who is really intensely focused on the family. I think that the best way to watch this video and learn about this case, to really appreciate what this family went through, is to put yourself in the position of being the Broaddus family. That's the family that purchases the house. Imagine you're in their position. Would you have stayed or would you have left? And I'd love to hear about it in the comments section. So let's dive in. In June of 2014, Derek and Maria Broaddus purchased their dream home. It is a $1.3 million 6-bedroom house in Westfield, New Jersey, which is a very affluent northern New Jersey town. So the house they purchased was on Boulevard, that's the street name, and Boulevard within Westfield is what at the time was like the street. If you lived on Boulevard, you had made it. I would say that times have changed
because now Boulevard is remembered as the place where this case happened. So I would say it's probably not the best place to live anymore. But at the time, it was like Derek and Maria were living their dreams and they knew it. 3 days after the sale of the house, they hadn't moved in yet. Derek had gone to the house to do some painting of the walls and some simple house renovations. I think he was just so excited about this house. He just wanted to go over and just kind of be in the space. So his wife and his kids are back at their old house that they had sold but hadn't moved out of yet. And so he's at the new house and he's doing these simple renovations, and he's like, you know what, I'm gonna check the mail. Because even though they'd only owned the house for 3 days, he was like, you know what the heck, see what it feels like to go collect the mail, because this is gonna be my new home. And so he goes out and he opens the mailbox, and inside is this little tiny card-shaped envelope addressed to the new owners.
Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now, and as it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I'll find out.
The letter goes on to identify what kind of car they were driving. It was a Honda minivan. It went on to say how many contractors were in and around the house over the past couple of days that were doing some renovations on the house. It even said that, I believe I've counted that you have 3 children. Someday I will learn their names and I will call to them and I will take them from you. You know, it's like a reconnaissance of his family had already begun as soon as they moved in. And so Derek is reading through this letter and he's realizing that whoever is sending this, this is not a friendly neighbor at this point. This is someone who is out to harm them in some way. So he takes the letter, he runs back into the house, shuts all the windows, locks all the doors, leaves the house and goes right back to his wife and his kids that are at their old home. And they promptly call the police. Police show up, they read the letter, and they're like, what is this? Do you have enemies? Who wrote you this? Because even the language inside the letter was it was not quite Old English, but close. It was like this bizarre writing, and it was just very stalkerish and awful, and the police just don't really know what to make of it. And Derek and Maria are obviously very upset. They haven't even moved into the house yet, but this is a big cause for concern. So the letter did not have a return address, but at the end of the letter, it just said,
who am I? I could be someone that's walking by your house every day. I could be someone driving by your house every day. I could be one of your neighbors. I could be anybody that you see at any given day, and you'll never know.
And then it just says, signed, The Watcher. After the police leave that night and promise to launch their own investigation, Derek and Maria, they're totally on edge. And so they write an email, even though it's super late, to the Woods family. They're the family that sold the house to Derek and Maria. And they say, hey, we just got this strange threatening letter. Have you received anything like this? Because the Watcher claims to have been watching you for the entire time you were there. And the Woods family writes back and they say, 3 days, I think it was 3 days before we actually left the house, we did receive a letter. It wasn't threatening. It was just thanking us for our time in the house and treating it with respect, and that it would be taken care of going forward, and that this person would look after the house for us, and it was signed The Watcher. But to be honest, we didn't think much of it. We crumpled it up and threw it away. So the Broadduses decide that they are not going to rush to actually move into the new house. They had thought about doing it, but they decide with this letter that maybe it's best to hold off a little bit. And so Derek and Maria would do day trips with the kids. They'd go do day trips, do some renovations, make sure that the contractors that were there were doing a good job getting the house in order, and then they would come back to the house that they were still living in. About 2 weeks after that letter was found, Maria is there with the kids, and she gets to the new house and she sees there's a letter from the Watcher, the same envelope, same writing on the outside. And so she immediately calls the police, even before she reads it. She opens it up and it says,
"Welcome again to your new home at 657 Boulevard. The workers have been busy and I have been watching you unload carfuls of your personal belongings. The dumpster is a nice touch. Have they found what's in the walls yet? In time, they will."
The watcher goes on to identify each of their kids by nickname and by birth order, which implies that whoever this was close enough to Maria or to Derek when they were speaking directly to their kids using their nicknames that they overheard. Because it's one thing to know the children's full names, because it's possible that you could have looked it up online or something, but to know their nicknames, that implies a level of proximity that even though they knew the watcher was probably in the neighborhood, almost definitely, this meant they were practically on top of one another. And it gets creepier. The watcher also in this letter asks, about one of the children and says, "Is she going to be an artist? I saw her using her easel yesterday." Well, the easel that this girl had been using is in a back room of the house that is mostly obscured by trees and shrubbery. There's really only one vantage point where you could see this child, and it would mean you're right on the property, like pretty much in plain view of anybody there. And with Maria and Derek and basically everyone on high alert looking for this person, it seems odd that they could be able to see this girl working at her easel in this kind of hidden back room and not be spotted. And then, of course, to kind of seal the deal, making this letter just totally terrifying, they go on to say,
"Do your kids go in the basement? I'd be afraid if I were them. It's far away from the rest of the house, and if you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream. Who has the bedrooms facing the street? I'll know as soon as you move in. Then I can plan better."
So at this point, Derek and Maria are in full crisis mode, because it's one thing to be watched, which is bad. It's another when the person watching you is now overtly threatening your family, your kids. It's a bad situation. So Derek and Maria at this point, they don't know if they're even ever going to move into this new house. It felt unsafe. And so for a few weeks, they're kind of teetering on whether it's worth moving in or not, and so that they aren't there. They're not going to the new house at all. And a third letter arrives basically saying, "Where are you? The house misses you," obviously from the watcher. At one point between the first letter and third letter, Derek was speaking with John Schmidt, who lived 2 doors down from their new property on Boulevard. And John was saying that Derek ought to look into the Langfords. It was a family that lived right next to their new house, kind of a little bit of a strange family. It was a 90-something-year-old mother and her adult children who lived with her, who were all in their 60s. And one of the children, Michael, he was just known in the area about being a little bit odd. Like, he would just kind of creep out other people. It wasn't uncommon to have him like walk across people's property, like little things like that, like looking in windows, just giving the vibe that he was a little bit strange and people didn't really like being around him. So Derek brings it up to the police that, "Hey, you should look into Michael Langford. He lives right near us. Neighbors are saying he's a little bit off." The police were like, "Actually, he was the first person we talked to. We brought him in, we questioned him, he denied it, we have no evidence tying him to it, and we just don't think it's him." And then later on in the investigation, they would actually do a DNA sample from one of the letters, and they would find out that it was a woman's DNA. And so that effectively ruled out Michael Langford, but the Langfords had a daughter. And so they decided maybe it could be her. And so they actually got a water bottle from her that they found, and they tested that, and it wasn't a match. So the Langfords were ruled out. Derek is growing increasingly more paranoid and angry. He went from being, scared of what was potentially going to happen to feeling like, how dare you threaten my family, my kids? And he started telling the police, like, if you don't find who's doing this, I'm going to figure out who it is. And then you're not going to be dealing with, a stalking case. You're going to be dealing with a different kind of case, if you catch my drift. And so the police were like, "Don't do anything crazy. We're working as hard as we can. It's just there's not much to go on here." Derek wasn't okay with that. He set up this elaborate camera system in and around his house, the new house. He started staying at the new house, turning off all the lights and crouching behind windows and staring at the mailbox in hopes of being able to confront anybody who went near it. He ended up hiring 2 former FBI agents to launch his own private investigation. He hired a handwriting expert to analyze the letters themselves to see if they could pick up details about who this was and potentially profile them.
And this person, all they could conclude was it was someone who was really, really mad. But all those things really didn't lead to any results. You know, it was just Derek had become obsessed, and he was willing to basically do anything to find out who the heck is writing these letters. So at this point, the Broadduses had already sold their old house. They were still living in it because they hadn't moved into the new house, the house being watched. But at some point, the new owners of the house they sold were ready to move in. And so the Broadduses had to move in with Maria's family, but were still paying the mortgage on 657 Boulevard. At this point, the community started kind of spreading rumors about the Broaddus family. People believed that the reason they weren't moving into this beautiful new home was, you know, they were getting a divorce, or they had some legal problems. You know, the letters and what was going on with these letters, that was not widely known. There was speculation about it, but no one really knew for sure. So Derek and Maria kind of gradually became pariahs, and they ultimately decided that they're just going to sell this house, this new house they purchased, because they need the money. They've tied up a lot of money in it, and they feel like, you know what, we'll sell the house and we'll move on. But by the time they listed it, enough rumors were circulating about the weirdness around that house and why no one was moving into it, and the weirdness with Derek and Maria, that nobody wanted to buy. And so they initially list this property above what they paid because they'd put $100,000 into the house in renovations. They just kept doing renovations, and that was their way of justifying not moving in. They were like, we'll keep fixing it up. It'll be better once we move in. But, you know, so they put $100K in and no one bid. They lower the price, no one bid. They continued to lower the price to where it was like a full-blown deficit. Still, no one made an offer. So it sat vacant. At this point, Maria and Derek turned their frustration towards the previous owners, because as I mentioned earlier, they had received a letter from the Watcher. Granted, it was, you know, at the very end of their stay in this house, but it was before they gave over the keys to the Broaddus family. And Derek and Maria felt like the fact that they got an anonymous letter that was literally signed The Watcher, that name alone was kind of ominous enough that they felt like the Woods family should have disclosed that to the Broaddus family before they moved in. And so they filed a legal complaint against the Woods family, basically saying that you held information that potentially would have kept us from moving in and not having this problem. Well, Derek and Maria were assured by their legal team that at most, you know, a small legal newswire might pick up this lawsuit, and that would be it. But the story, it got picked up by a number of outlets. The fact that they were filing a complaint against the previous owners over basically a stalker. And all of a sudden, they were all over the news. The Broaddus family had over 300 media requests. There were TV stations and news stations camped out on the front lawn. Everybody wanted to know what's going on with this bizarre, you know, Watcher. It became this huge thing. And so for Derek and Maria and their family, they had to vacate Westfield because it was basically not only unsafe because they were being watched by this phantom menace, but now, like, they couldn't escape the media pressure and all the speculation from their nosy neighbors. It was just a total train wreck. Finally, the Broaddus family got some good news, literally years after this first letter is sent and they tied up all their money in this new house. A family agrees to rent the house. Now, this is going to be at a loss for the Broaddus family. The rent money will not even cover the mortgage. But to them, who've just been sitting on this worthless property that's just been, you know, eating away at their finances, this was a huge win. The Broaddus family, they put into the contract with this new family that, hey, you know what's going on here with the Watcher. If you get another letter, you're able to renege on this contract. And so the new family moves in, and 2 weeks into being there, what do you think happens? Another letter shows up.
You wonder who the Watcher is. Turn around, idiots. Maybe you even spoke to me, one of the so-called neighbors who has no idea who the Watcher could be. Or maybe you do know and are too scared to tell anyone. My soldiers of the Boulevard followed my orders to a T. They carried out their mission and they saved the soul of 657 Boulevard with my orders. All hail the Watcher.
The renter was also mentioned in this letter and was definitely spooked. But
they decide that they're still willing to stick around because they knew going in this could happen. They just asked that the Broaddus family install even more cameras. And so they did that, they installed more cameras, and they decided to stay. Derek and Maria are obviously disheartened, but at the same time, now they have more evidence against the Watcher. And so they take this new letter, they bring it to the police, and unfortunately, much like the other few letters they'd received, there was nothing much to go on, except that you have this person claiming to watch them, but no hard evidence to tie it to anybody. So once again, they got nowhere. After renting this house out for a while to this family at a deficit, the Broaddus family in 2019 finally decide to just sell the house at a $400,000 deficit. It was just a huge nightmare, and at this point they were willing to pay $400,000 to get rid of it. Before they sold it, they received one more letter, and this is what it said.
You are despised by the house, and the Watcher won.
Despite the investigation by police and the unofficial investigation by Derek's private investigators, we are not anywhere closer to figuring out who the Watcher is, or what's hidden in the walls. It's all still a huge mystery. Many people have speculated that the Broaddus family, that Derek specifically, was probably the person who wrote the letters, because in fact, he would later admit that he wrote a number of anonymous letters to people in the community that had been bad-mouthing he and his family. But he said it was purely out of frustration. I wanted to scare them and make them, feel what it was like to have the Watcher watching them. But he said, like this whole situation has really devastated them financially and emotionally, and kind of ruined their ability to stay in the town that they loved so much. So it just, the angle that he stood to benefit from this, it's not a very good theory in my opinion. In addition, recently Netflix bought the rights to their story. But if Derek and his family had said, what we're going to do is we're going to set up this elaborate mystery around ourselves for years in order to secure movie rights, you'd be putting your kids through something so traumatic. And so the idea of like having your kids have to live with the fear of being attacked and getting bullied at school because, everybody talks in these communities, that seems far-fetched too. It remains to be seen who the Watcher is, but to this day, it remains a mystery. So if you haven't already, please click like and subscribe. I am going to be trying to do 2 or more stories a week. I'm really making a push to make YouTube my primary, so I hope you'll tag along. If you want to talk to me separately, you can DM me on Instagram. That's JohnBallen416. Also, go follow me on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen. And that's going to do it, guys. I hope this was interesting, and I'll talk to you soon. If I told you that a college-age male went out drinking with his buddies and then wound up dead in a river, you might suspect that he got drunk and fell in, accidental drowning. But what if I told you that there were dozens and dozens of these college-age males that are going out drinking with their buddies and then being found dead in rivers, and they're all being labeled accidental drownings, except many of them are found with little to no water in their lungs, and forensics tell us that they were actually alive for several hours, days, even months after the night out with their friends. One former police detective named David Paulides, who normally researches missing people in parks and forests, has begun researching these strange accidental drownings all over North America in his book called A Sobering Coincidence, as part of his Missing 411 book series. Today, I'm going to share with you 3 cases that have all been covered by David Paulides. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all I do, and I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, then I would encourage you to slightly overcook the like button's popcorn and subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 2005, Todd Geib was 22 years old. He lived in Michigan. He was an avid outdoorsman. He liked to go deer hunting. He loved to catch trophy fish, and he loved his family. And routinely, after he moved out of the house, he would drive on the weekends the 5 miles north to his parents' house and would spend lots of time with his parents and his extended family. On June 11th, 2005, Todd was visiting his parents at their house,
He was there for dinner, and after dinner, he went back to his house. He checked in with his roommate, who was actually his cousin, and then following that, he drove to a local bar to get a few drinks. At about 9:30 that night, he decides to leave the bar and walk to this big orchard where there was this huge annual keg party that he and his friends would go to. He leaves his car at the bar, and he walks to this orchard, and it's perfect weather. All of his friends are there. He's having this great time, and he's there all the way until midnight. It was getting late. Todd felt tired, so he told a couple of his friends that he was going to head home. He was going to leave his car at the bar, and he was just going to walk back to his house. The area that this orchard was in was right near his home, and so he knew this area extremely well, and it was only about a mile south to walk to his house. So all of his friends said bye to him. They said he seemed totally normal. They watched him walk south towards his house, and that was the last anybody saw of him. On his walk home, Todd would make 4 phone calls to friends and to family. And the last one he made was at about 12:45 in the morning, and it was to his friends, and he told them that he was in a field and he couldn't breathe. And they kept asking him, like, what are you talking about? And all they heard was very heavy breathing on the phone. They couldn't tell if it was his or if someone else had taken the phone and was now breathing into it. But then the phone cuts out, and they tried calling him back, and there was no answer. They couldn't get in touch with him. The next day, when Todd did not show up at a family get-together, something he never would have missed unless he told them ahead of time, his family knew something was wrong. Plus, they had those strange phone calls the night before. They checked in with his friends. They said, yeah, we haven't heard from him. They went over to his house. He wasn't there. And so that's when they called the police. A massive search is kicked off involving canines and helicopters, and they're not finding anything. 3 weeks after Todd had gone missing, a couple was walking around this lake that was located north of the orchard where Todd was at that big keg party. And the wife looked out into the water, and she said she thought she saw something bobbing. She couldn't tell what it was, but it was just this weird object that stood out to her. And she and her partner walked down to the edge of the lake, and they looked out, and at first she thought it was a person who was swimming, just kind of bobbing up and down, because their body position was such that their shoulders and head were totally out of the water. And so it was a strange sight, and they knew that it didn't seem right. So they called the police. Police show up, and it turns out that this person was Todd Geib, and they were deceased. When searchers found out that it was Todd Geib in the lake, their reaction was, no way. We have witnesses saying he was walking south after he left the keg party. Why is he in a lake way to the north of the keg party? It's in the complete opposite direction. Also, investigators were baffled at his body position, because if he was a drowning victim, you would expect him to be face down in the water, as most drowning victims are. But for him to be upright, shoulders out of the water, it doesn't make any sense unless there's ice in the water to kind of prop him up, and there wasn't any ice in the water. His toxicology report showed that in addition to alcohol in his system, he had a very high dose of an antidepressant, something that he wasn't prescribed, and he didn't have any history of mental illness and had never been prescribed any antidepressant in his life. His body was pristine. It did not have any of the hallmarks, the bloating you would expect from being in water for 21 days. In fact, it was concluded that it was impossible for his body to have been in the water for all 21 days that he had been missing. His autopsy showed that he had almost no water in his lungs, even though his death was classified as an accidental drowning. When the news broke that this was an accidental drowning, the family and friends pushed for a closer examination of this case because it wasn't adding up. And so a noted pathologist looked at all of the evidence and determined that at most, Todd had been in the water for maybe 3 days, and he had almost certainly been deceased when he was placed in the water, which is why there wasn't any water in his lungs, and it's potentially why he was in that position that he was in, that upright position. So, as you'll see in all of these cases, why are we calling it an accidental drowning still? And where was Todd from the day he went missing for those 15 to 17 days before he was placed in the water? And what did he mean when he was on the phone the night he went missing and said he was in a field and couldn't breathe? And what was all that breathing in the background? Lots of questions on this one. On January 25th, 2017, 23-year-old Dakota James was out bar hopping in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania with some buddies. At some point, he was tired, and so he decided to walk home. A CCTV camera has a clear shot of Dakota James after he left the bar, walking through a plaza. He's on his phone. No one seems to be following him. He seems like he's okay. He's not stumbling as he makes his way home. The next day, when he didn't show up for work, that was so out of character for him that his work immediately called the police, notified his parents, and this massive search is launched. But unfortunately, nothing turns up. 40 days after he had gone missing, his body was found in the Ohio River 10 miles away from where he had been missing. And the general theory became, when he was walking home after that CCTV camera picked him up, he must have stopped by the water to relieve himself, fell in. The water was so cold at the time that he would have gone into shock and then basically been doomed. And then he drifted 10 miles to this location. But there's a couple big issues with that. Number one, in order to get from where he went missing to where he wound up, he would have had to go through this dam. And the dam is this very violent section of water where if a body were to go through there, it would get ripped to pieces. But when they found his body, it was clear he had not gone through a dam. In fact, his body was pristine. It looked like he hadn't been in the water for very long at all, despite 40 days elapsing since he had gone missing. When his toxicology report came back, he had alcohol in his system as well as a high level of GHB, which is a very powerful sedative. And like you'll see in many of these cases, he had no water in his lungs, but this was ruled an accidental drowning. The family was unwilling to accept that as a cause of death, so they went out and hired a world-renowned forensic pathologist named Dr. Wecht to come in and analyze all of the evidence, look at the autopsy report, and try to see if there's anything that was missed. And what Dr. Wecht finds is on Dakota's neck, there were ligature marks, as if rope or some sort of twine had been wrapped around his neck, which was later disputed by the other medical examiner who said that was dried blood, but Dr. Wecht swears there was ligature marks on his neck. Dr. Wecht also concluded that there was absolutely no way, based on decomposition levels, that Dakota was in the water for more than a couple of days. And he believed that he was dead or unconscious when he actually went into the water, which is why there was no water in his lungs. So it begs the question, if we believe Dr. Wecht, where was Dakota from the day he went missing until 37 days later when he apparently went into the water? And again, why are we calling this an accidental drowning when he didn't drown? Lucas Holman was an incredible athlete, 6'3", incredible at baseball, football, and basketball, which was his primary love. In fact, he was so good in high school that he was recruited to play at a Division I program, the University of Wisconsin. And in fact, he got a scholarship to play there. So he went to the University of Wisconsin. When he wasn't getting much playing time there, he opted to transfer early on in his career to lacrosse, which was a Division III school, but he figured he could get more playing time that way. It was at this time that he realized, you know what, I'm probably not going to play basketball professionally. And so he began orchestrating his life towards a career in finance, and in fact was telling his family that once he graduated school, he was actually going to get a master's degree in business at the University of Wisconsin. On September 29th, Lucas and his friends are at this huge German festival, drinking a ton of beer, having a great time. At some point in the night, they transition to some of the bars downtown, and they're all having a great time. It's very crowded. But at some point in the night, Lucas disappears. No one knows where he went or who he was with, but Lucas was a big, confident guy. They figured, you know what, what's the worst that could happen to him? I'm sure he's fine. And so his friends ultimately just go home and don't think much of it. The next day, when no one could get in touch with Lucas, his friends and family called the police and said, you gotta look into this. We don't know where he is. The police went to the strip of bars that they had been bar hopping between, and they asked to see the security footage from the night before. And in a very unfortunate coincidence, all of these bars, their cameras were down. So they weren't able to get a glimpse of where potentially Lucas might have gone. At one point, someone came forward and said that they knew where he was and that they had spent time with him outside of the bar, but it would later turn out that that person was lying and they were actually charged with submitting false information to the police. On the 2nd of October, divers located Lucas's body. He was in 10 feet of water, about 20 feet from the edge. When they pulled him out, he didn't have any significant scratches or marks on his body to indicate some sort of altercation. It just looked like he had fallen in the water and drowned, and so his death was quickly ruled an accidental drowning. The initial medical report said that Lucas had fallen in the water and had been there for about 24 hours before he was found. But upon closer examination, it was determined that he had only been in there for maybe 8 to 12 hours. So he's only been in the water for a few hours. meaning there had been at least a few days where he was not in the water and was alive. In the toxicology report, it showed that he had a high level of alcohol in his system, as well as, like Dakota James, a high level of this sedative called GHB. Also, it was noted that his belt buckle had been tightened way tighter than he normally wore it, and some people speculated that it looked as if someone else had tried to dress him, maybe after he was deceased or when he was unconscious. And then perhaps the strangest part of the case is the day after Lucas had gone missing, his roommate, who had been in the room the whole time that Lucas and his friends have been out at Oktoberfest and going to the bar, so he'd been home the whole time, he goes to bed and wakes up to an alarm. But it's not his alarm, it's Lucas's alarm. It's his phone going off that's underneath Lucas's bed. Lucas definitely had his phone while he was out, but somehow his phone got under his bed, but Lucas was not there and had never been there in the night unless he managed to sneak into the room without waking up his roommate and place his phone under the bed and then leave again. It didn't make any sense. Police would never subpoena the phone's records to find out where it went that night, so we're left wondering how in the heck it got under his bed if he was never in there. And like all the other accidental drowning cases that we're looking at, where was Lucas from the time he went missing on the 29th of September and then wound up in the water at some point on the 2nd of October? He was alive for those few days and he wasn't in the water. So where was he? Some people say that these accidental drownings and all the others that are going on, these suspicious accidental drownings, are actually the result of a group of serial killers known as the smiley-faced killers, who leave smiley faces around the area where bodies are discovered. That's still very much up for debate. Other people say that there could be something paranormal going on, or this really is just a case of some drunk college kids slipping into the water and drowning. But it's up to you to decide what you think is going on. I'd love to hear in the comments what you think, and I'll get back to all the early commenters. So get in there and let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, and you haven't done this already, please slightly overcook the like button's popcorn and subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to learn more about these accidental drownings, you got to check out David Paulides' book called A Sobering Coincidence. It's part of his Missing 411 series. I have a link to where you can purchase those books in the description. If you have a story suggestion, I would ask that you submit it to our subreddit, just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. I look on there every single day, and if I see a story that I like, I will use it, and I will credit you if I intentionally use your idea. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram. My username is JohnBallen416. I also just started using Twitter. My username over there is also JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok, where my username is MrBallen. So whether I see you on Reddit, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, guys, see ya.
Today's story is about an infamous caving incident. The reason for its infamy is largely because of a photo that was taken during the event. Now, if you didn't know anything about this photo and you just looked at it, it would be haunting and kind of unsettling. But when you have the full picture, the full context of what's going on in this photo, it will leave you highly disturbed. That photo will be shown at the end of today's video. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to cut the like button's front lawn, but when you're done, be sure to blow all the grass clippings through an open window into their living room. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On January 30th, 1925, a 37-year-old man named Floyd Collins walked through this huge forest in central Kentucky inside of a national park. As he walked along, his boots splashed in the melting snow and mud on the ground, and above him, all he heard was the sound of water dripping down amongst the leaves. It was warmer than it had been in several days, and so that was why Floyd was out here. He was trying to take advantage of the nice weather. And so after walking for a while on this muddy, slushy trail, the trees around Floyd began to thin out, and then eventually he reached the edge of the tree line, and in front of him was this huge clearing. Now, in this clearing, the trail he was on continued straight ahead, but it came to a stop in front of this huge cavern-like opening in the side of a hill. And so without hesitation, Floyd stepped out of the trees into the sunlight, and he walked the rest of the trail right up to the opening of this cavern, and he stopped and just stared and smiled. This cavern-like space on the side of this hill was the entrance to a cave known as Sand Cave. And Floyd had spent the last week coming out to Sand Cave and exploring the different tunnels, but today his plan was to go as deep and as far inside of this cave as he possibly could. Caves were a huge tourist attraction in this region, and Floyd was a very experienced caver who had been caving since he was 6 years old, and he knew that most of Sand Cave had not been explored. And so if he could go in there and explore all the different parts of the cave and map it all out and make sure it was safe, it was sure to be a huge moneymaker. He could bring people here and lead them on guided tours. So Floyd left the muddy path he had been walking on and stepped foot inside of this grand entrance to Sand Cave. It's basically this 250-foot wide cathedral-like space inside of this hill with ceilings high enough you could stand, but it's totally dark in there. And despite being this big open space, it very quickly funnels to this one kind of tunnel that goes straight down and connects to all these offshoot underground passageways, many of which have never been explored before. And so, as Floyd walked across this big open entryway, he lit his oil lamp and then began mentally preparing himself for what he was about to do, which was going to be very claustrophobia-inducing, even for a very experienced caver. And so Floyd reached the back of this huge entryway, and he reached this tunnel that would connect to the rest of the cave, and he began walking down it. And this tunnel was not very restricting. You could stand in it, you could move around in it, but it was very short. It was 15 feet straight down at an angle, where at the bottom of those 15 feet was a square hole in the ground. And Floyd, having been here the previous week, knew that once you go through this hole, the real caving begins. Now you're going to be down on your hands and knees, wriggling your way through these very tight and restricting areas where you don't really know where you're going, because again, a lot of this stuff has never been explored before. But this is why Floyd loved caving. He loved the adventure and the risk of doing things like this. And so Floyd got to this hole, he put his oil lamp down on the ground, he casually lowered himself feet first into this hole, which dropped down several feet, and then once he was on firm ground, he reached up, grabbed his oil lamp, and pulled it into the hole with him. Once he was inside of this lower level space, he crouched down and looked around, and off to his right was a tunnel that he could crawl through that seemed to lead to a series of other tunnels. And so he puts his lamp in front of him, he gets down, and he begins crawling through this tunnel. And after a little while, he reaches this kind of fork in the road where he had several options of very narrow tunnels to choose from. Now, the previous week, Floyd had gone down several of these tunnels and mapped out where they went, but there was one tunnel in particular at this fork that was very narrow. It was likely the most narrow of all the tunnels, but from where he had seen the last week, it looked like it went pretty far without obstruction. And so he immediately began going head first into this tunnel where he had no idea where it was going to go. Think about that. If you go head first into a tunnel and you get stuck, what are you going to do? You can't really go anywhere. So this guy is like totally fearless, just going head first into what most people would consider a nightmare scenario. And so the way Floyd would approach these very tight tunnels is he would put his oil lamp out in front of him, and then he'd keep his hands over his head, and he'd kind of wriggle his way head first and push his lamp along the way. And so that's what he did. He began going into this really restrictive tunnel. It's hard to breathe because the walls are so tight on his chest cavity. But as he's going, eventually the ceiling begins to slope upward just enough that he can pull himself up onto his hands and knees and kind of catch his breath.
By this point, Floyd was approximately 55 feet underground. That's where this little pocket was, where he could get up on his hands and knees and breathe. And so from this position, he still could see with his lamp that this tunnel continued to snake further and further down, and his hope was that eventually it would lead to a big underground chamber that was not just big enough to go to your hands and knees on, but was big enough you could stand and walk around in, because those were the big tourist attractions. Not only because it seems like another world underground that you can fully explore and walk around in, but also, as Floyd knew from his past experience of going into other caves, a lot of times those big underground chambers are full of Native American artifacts. And again, that was a huge potential moneymaker for people like Floyd, because it allowed him to advertise that this cave where tourists could go explore was full of all this rich history. And so Floyd eventually, after catching his breath in this little spot, got back down onto his stomach with his hands out in front of him, with the lamp out ahead of his fingers, and he began going deeper and deeper into this unexplored section of Sand Cave. And as he inched along, even though the ceiling remained very tight on top of him, he's totally compressed to the ground, the walls on either side of him began to expand, which meant Floyd, if he wanted to, could actually turn himself around, although he couldn't stand up. And so Floyd is making his way down this very low ceiling area when he notices his oil lamp is beginning to flicker, which means it's going to go out soon. Now, Floyd wasn't concerned about suddenly being in the darkness inside of a cave. Now, to most people, that would be terrifying, but Floyd, again, was so experienced, he was very confident that he could easily make his way out again just by touch. He didn't need the light. But he did know that trying to move around inside of a cave in the darkness was dangerous, and so he should not do that if he could avoid it. And so as much as Floyd wanted to continue and hopefully find something incredible inside of this cave, he decided he really needed to just turn around and go back to the surface and come back the next day to continue exploring. And so, because this part of the tunnel he was in was really wide, he was able to turn himself around and drag his lamp until he was facing back uphill, and then he rolled onto his back. So his head is pointing back up where he came from, and his feet are pointing in the direction that he had previously been traveling, and he's on his back. And so his oil lamp is above his head. He can move his arms side to side because, again, it's pretty wide in the area he's in, but his head is pretty restricted by the ceiling. And he began inching with his heels and pushing with his arms, moving up the tunnel on his back. And as he would move, he'd use his head and his hands to push the oil lamp back up the direction he was going. And for a little while, this system worked great. But at some point, right as he was getting close to that area where he was able to previously get on his hands and knees and catch his breath, Floyd accidentally kind of rushed and pushed his lamp too hard and knocked it over, which extinguished the light. And so suddenly, Floyd was cast into total darkness. Have you ever thought to yourself, wow, MrBallen is so cool. I just wish there was some way he and I could come together and lay the smackdown on the ultra-successful, highly popular social platform Discord. Well, if that's you, today's your lucky day. Because our partners over at Discord just told me that if I wanted to host a live storytelling event on Discord, they would uncap the number of people who could watch it live. For reference, Discord has never done this before, because if you allow an unlimited number of people to join a live stream at one time, it could easily destroy the server temporarily. But you know what they told me when I asked them how they felt about having that be a potential outcome? They said, "Don't worry, John. That would only happen if you had at least 10,000 people on the show at once. And that's not going to happen." Those fools. In 2 weeks, on May 19th at 7 p.m. Central, I'm going to host that live storytelling event on Discord. It's totally free, and I need all of you fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious to do me a favor and log in right at the start, just so we can surpass the 10,000 viewer mark and destroy Discord's server temporarily. And then after they fix it, which will be quick, I will spend the rest of the live stream telling you stories. Joining our official MrBallen Discord server, where I'll do this live stream, is quick and easy. All you gotta do is click the link in the description, choose your adventure, agree to follow our community rules, and then on May 19th at 7 p.m. Central, click on the live storytelling event. Me and old Sing-Along will see you there. Now, again, Floyd was not concerned or really even scared about being in darkness inside of this cave, but this was not a good scenario and he knew it. But he told himself, stay calm, he knew where he was in the cave, he just needed to get to that little pocket, he'd catch his breath, and then he'd continue his way back up, eventually reach that hole in the ceiling, that square hole, he'd climb out, make his way out of the cave, and boom, he'd be done. And so Floyd just continued to push the now extinguished oil lamp above his head, and he continued to inch with his heels and moved his arms around to keep going backwards up this tunnel. But then, right before Floyd reached that pocket inside of the tunnel where he could get onto his hands and knees, he heard the sound of falling rocks somewhere below him, kind of near his legs. Now it's pitch black, he can't see anything, and so Floyd just kind of held his breath and hoped that whatever was happening wouldn't affect him. But then he felt a shooting pain in his left leg. A 27-pound rock had broken loose from the low ceiling and landed on his left ankle. Now, at first, Floyd was actually relieved that the rock had landed only on his left leg. And in fact, his leg was actually kind of positioned in a depression on the floor of the cave. And so the rock didn't really hit his left ankle directly. It kind of like hit the ground and then leaned onto his left ankle. And his left ankle was kind of protected in the depression in the cave floor. And so Floyd's thinking, thank goodness it only landed on my ankle and not on my head or my chest, because then I'd be dead. And so, after catching his breath and kind of calming down, Floyd tensed his body and pulled his left leg as hard as he could to clear this 27-pound rock, but his foot wouldn't budge. And so Floyd thought he would just reach down and kind of dig his foot out. He'd just move the rock out of the way. But even though this cave had widened out on either side of Floyd when he had gone deeper and deeper into it, because he had retraced his steps, he was farther up the tunnel where those sides had really come in much closer to him. And so he wasn't able to actually reach down and touch the rock. The walls made it impossible. And so he wasn't able to use his hands to clear this rock. And so Floyd is pinned underground, unable to move, in absolute pitch darkness, inside of a cave that's practically crushing his chest because the ceiling is so low, and he knows it's unstable. The ceiling has now fallen off, so there's a chance more rocks could come in at any time. I mean, this is like a worst case scenario for anybody who goes caving. But Floyd told himself to just stay calm. He knew this was a very bad situation, but people were certain to find out he was missing, and they knew he had gone to Sand Cave, and they would come here, they would find him, and they would rescue him. And so Floyd just decided he would wait. And for an agonizing 30 hours, remember, 30 hours of pitch blackness, trapped in a totally claustrophobic environment. 30 hours of this, no food, no water, can't go to the bathroom. He's laying there for 30 hours, and then finally, he hears a voice coming from somewhere near the entrance of this cave. And when he heard that voice, it was like the sweetest sound he had ever heard. Because not only did they represent help, but the voice was coming from Floyd's brother, Homer, who was also a very experienced caver. And so Floyd's thinking, thank goodness, I'm saved. And so Homer was able to navigate from the entrance down all the way to the tunnel that Floyd was in. And Homer got to that spot in the tunnel where Floyd had gone to his hands and knees, that pocket there. So Homer's in that pocket, and he can see Floyd is only a few feet away from him. He can see Floyd's head right there. And so Homer, who had a lamp, he shines the light on Floyd, and the two brothers don't waste any time with small talk. Instead, Homer, who had his oil lamp, had set it up right next to them, and he began feeding Floyd sausage sandwiches and giving him sips of water. And then Homer would tell Floyd that he just did not have the equipment to help Floyd get out right now,
But Homer was going to go back to the surface, get men, get supplies, and then come back and save Floyd. And so Floyd is very thankful. He's very relieved. He says goodbye to Homer, and Homer turns and makes his way back up to the surface. 15 hours later, Homer would return by himself. And so at this point, Floyd has been trapped for 45 hours. And so Floyd, he's laying there kind of in and out of consciousness, and he hears the sound of Homer calling out to him, and then he hears the sound of Homer chiseling away at some rocks. It would turn out Homer's plan to save Floyd was basically to chisel away the side of this section of tunnel that Floyd was stuck in order to be able to reach down and somehow, some way, clear the rock off of Floyd's leg and then pull Floyd up. Now, Floyd understood, of course, that this plan of chiseling away the side of this tunnel to make it wider was going to take some time. But luckily, Homer had shown up with more food and water, and they chatted the whole time as Homer worked. And so Floyd was in good spirits, and Homer was very optimistic. But after 8 hours of Homer slowly chiseling his way, widening this tunnel, he hadn't made much progress, and he was totally exhausted. I mean, you gotta remember that the angle he was working at was horrible. He was basically crouched down on his hands and knees, chipping away at this rock. And so after those 8 hours, Homer would leave Floyd and go back home and sleep and eat and drink and kind of recover. But he told Floyd, don't worry, tomorrow more men will be here to help chisel away this tunnel and get Floyd out of there. But over the course of the next 50 hours, Floyd remained trapped inside of this tunnel with the rock pinning his leg, and despite Homer and several other men getting down there and very diligently chipping away at this tunnel, it just was not happening very quickly. And so over the course of those 50 hours, Floyd began going in and out of consciousness, and he began not being able to differentiate between what was real and what was not. At one point, he would say that he believed the cave had kind of opened up and these angels riding golden chariots with flaming wheels had come in to save him. And as they were lifting him out of the cave, he smelled food and coffee. And then suddenly his hallucination cleared and he realized he was trapped in the darkness all alone, still in this cave. And it was like it destroyed his morale. And so Floyd is really starting to go downhill, and the rescuers are realizing they need to do something, and they need to do something now. But at the 130-hour mark, things got even worse for Floyd. As he was laying there in the tunnel, this was sometime in the middle of the night, and so no rescuers were actively down there trying to chisel their way down to him. He was laying there and he was listening to the sound of the running water somewhere outside the cave, and that sound was kind of amplified down to him. And then all of a sudden he heard the sound of falling rocks somewhere up above. And then when those rocks stopped and it went silent again, he could not hear the sound of the running water. It was very muffled. And that was when he realized that there must have been a cave-in somewhere higher up in the cave, which meant potentially there could be a significant block just to get down to him. Forget about widening this tunnel. I mean, he could be actually entombed inside of Sand Cave. And so Floyd did the only thing he could do, which was to pray. It would turn out that cave-in had indeed blocked the way for rescuers to get down to Floyd. And because of how extensive this cave-in was, the rescuers actually decided to start carving a brand new tunnel that would join up with the side of Floyd's tunnel. I mean, this is an even bigger undertaking than just chiseling the side of the tunnel that Floyd was in, which was their original plan and had taken several days. And so now they have to build this brand new tunnel to Floyd. And so finally, on February 16th, 1925, so a staggering 17 days from the time Floyd got first stuck in this cave, the rescue team finally punched through and reached Floyd. And as soon as they did, the lead rescuer looked over at Floyd, and then he paused, he turned up, and he just said, "Dead." It would turn out shortly after that cave-in, which sealed Floyd in completely inside of Sand Cave, at some point over the next couple of days, those rocks began to break free and tumble down the cave and began striking Floyd until finally one or several of those rocks hit him in the head or chest and killed him. So just imagine you are trapped. You've been there for several days. You're in total darkness. You're entombed inside of this cave. And periodically, rocks just come tumbling down and smash into you. Who knows how long it took to kill him, but that has to be one of the most agonizing ways to go ever. Shortly before that cave-in first happened, a photographer took a picture of Floyd, who at the time believed he was going to get out, and all the rescuers believed they were going to get him out. But shortly after this photo was taken, the cave-in would happen, and at that point, Floyd didn't know it, but he was doomed. Here is that photo. Floyd's body was eventually removed from Sand Cave. However, instead of being buried, because of the interest around this cave rescue that ultimately failed, there was a decision made to actually put Floyd's body on display inside of another cave. Basically, Floyd's body became a tourist attraction. And it would remain a tourist attraction for decades until finally he was removed from that cave and given a proper burial. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, where we have literally hundreds of stories just like this one, many of which are exclusive to the podcast, which means you cannot hear them on YouTube. Again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Today's story is a special one because this story was the very first one told on one of my personal favorite YouTube channels. The channel is called Wartime Stories, and basically the content is the strange, dark, and mysterious meets the battlefield and beyond. The host of Wartime Stories is Luke LaManna, and he was a recon Marine, so very high speed, and he's got a great radio voice. But most importantly, he ferrets out these totally insane stories from service members from their times all around the globe, running into these unexplainable phenomenon and seeing and witnessing and being a part of things that just didn't make any sense. I mean, the stories he finds are terrifying and so intriguing. But in addition to just wanting to plug this amazing YouTube channel, I actually have another reason why I'm talking about Wartime Stories, but you'll have to wait till later in this episode to find out why. But before we get into this Wartime Stories inspired story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button has spent hours and hours carefully cleaning and detailing their vintage car, offer to do them a favor by parking their car in their garage. And when you get in there, carefully back it into the garage, but then instead of putting it in park, just go ahead and hit the gas and smash the car into their house. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of August 16th, 1942, a woman named Ida Ruby was riding her horse on a dirt path right near a beach just south of San Francisco, California. Now, during the week, Ida was a telephone operator, but it was a Sunday, so she had time off, and the way she liked to spend her time off was by riding her horse along the coastline and, looking out at the beautiful water and taking in the nature and all these unbelievable cliffs that went down to the water. I mean, this was a beautiful area. And every time Ida would go out and do this little ride around, she would bring binoculars with her. And so anytime she saw something of interest, she would stop and, use her binoculars to see what it was, like animals or things out over the water. And on this particular Sunday, Ida turned a corner, and as soon as she did, something caught her attention off to her right, out over the water. And so she stopped her horse and she turned and she looked out, and the sea was very calm, and she could see way out just past the horizon was what looked like this black thing kind of hovering over the water. And instead of raising her binoculars right away, she just kind of squinted and looked off in the direction, and she quickly realized what it was. It was a blimp. Now, today, when we hear the word blimp, we very likely think of the Goodyear blimp that kind of sits over sporting events, with the big Goodyear logo stamped on the side of it. It's basically a big balloon with a gondola that sits underneath it for the person who's driving it and passengers. And that's actually exactly what Ida was seeing, a big oversized balloon with a gondola underneath it. But this was not a Goodyear blimp, it was a military blimp. Because this was 1942, right in the middle of World War II. And 9 months earlier, the United States had joined World War II after the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor.
And ever since then, Japanese submarines had been lurking off the coast of California, kind of all across the West Coast, out in the Pacific Ocean, and occasionally they would send torpedoes out and bomb the US mainland. And so the United States responded to this by launching this fleet of blimps that basically were able to get really low to the water, that could move really slowly, and they would basically fly all along the Pacific coastline looking for Japanese submarines. They could literally go down, and from their gondola, they could look down and actually see submarines and mark them for bombing runs or, scare them off. And so Ida, like anybody else who was living on the west coast of the United States at the time, was aware that there were blimps out over the ocean, but it was still a fairly uncommon sight. And so because of that, Ida was sort of intrigued, and so she raised her binoculars and she focused on this blimp, and she would see something that was so strange that even 80 years later, nobody can fully explain it. But to really understand why what she saw was so weird, we need to back up about 5 hours on the same day to about 6 a.m. at a military base just north of where Ida was seeing this blimp. And so at 6 a.m. at this military base, that particular blimp that Ida would later see was at this military base on the ground, and some Navy pilots and mechanics were preparing the blimp for a routine mission out over the San Francisco Bay to look for Japanese submarines. The intended path this blimp was going to take on this day was it would leave the base, and the pilot would take it over the famous Golden Gate Bridge, and then it would travel 28 miles to the west to the Farallon Islands. And then from there, the pilot would go 20 miles to the north to a peninsula called Point Reyes. And then from there, the pilot would head south along the coastline all the way back to base. This whole mission profile was scheduled to take about 4 hours. The pilots for this mission were going to be a 27-year-old Navy lieutenant named Ernest Cody and a 34-year-old officer named Charles Adams. And both of them were very experienced blimp pilots. They had done missions like this many times before. This was going to be a very routine mission for them. And then also, in addition to those two pilots, there would be a Navy mechanic who would join the two pilots in case there was any malfunctions with the blimp during the mission. And so everything was going to plan with this blimp that morning. There was nothing unusual about this mission, but right as the two pilots and the mechanic were literally getting inside of the gondola to begin this mission, Lieutenant Cody looked down at the control panel inside the blimp, and he noticed the blimp was way heavier than it should have been. Now, you have to understand that the level of rigor that went into preparing these blimps for flight was really intense. I mean, they were weighing every little thing that was put inside of this blimp because it was a really important part of flying these blimps, understanding how heavy it was. And so for this to be too heavy just made no sense. And so at first, Cody and Adams began tapping on the control panel, thinking maybe the panel itself was malfunctioning, and if they hit it hard enough, the little ticker would go back to a normal weight. But despite, hitting the panel, it still showed it was too heavy. And so they flagged over the mechanic, who was going to be joining them on the flight anyways. And the mechanic looked and kind of thought for a second and then realized, that day it had been very foggy. And so it was totally possible that all this extra moisture in the air had stuck to the surface of the balloon. And so collectively, that had added quite a bit of weight. I mean, this is a massive balloon, a lot of surface area, a lot of water. Now, this was not some crisis. At worst, this was an inconvenience. Basically, they had to wait until this moisture kind of burned off once the sun came out, and then they could fly the blimp. But Cody and Adams, they just didn't feel like waiting. This mission was so routine, so simple, they'd done it so many times. And so Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams decided that the easiest and fastest solution to this problem was simply to tell the mechanic who was going to come with them on this mission to not come with them. Without his weight inside of the gondola, even with this extra moisture in the blimp, it wouldn't matter. The blimp would still be light enough to fly with just the two pilots on board. The mechanic didn't care, so he hopped off, and then Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams took their seats inside the gondola, and sure enough, when they looked at the control panel, the blimp was ready to go. It was light enough. And so Lieutenant Cody fired up the blimp's engines, and just after 6 a.m. that morning, Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams lifted off the ground and began their routine mission. About an hour and a half later, at 7:38 a.m., Lieutenant Cody radioed back to air control, saying that so far the patrol had been totally routine, everything was going smoothly, they hadn't seen any Japanese submarines or anything out of the ordinary, and also Lieutenant Cody said they were positioned just east of the Farallon Islands, which meant they were exactly on course, and really everything did seem to be going exactly to plan. But 4 minutes later, Lieutenant Cody radioed back again to air control, and he said they had just spotted an oil slick down on the water. So basically, picture from their perspective, they saw that gleaming oil sitting on top of the ocean. And so at the time, this often signaled that below the surface of the water, under this oil slick, was a submarine. So this is like a telltale sign that the Japanese could be right here. So Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams told Air Control that they were going to descend in the blimp down to the water and fully investigate this oil slick, and then they'd report back. This last transmission happened at 7:50 a.m. A few minutes later, a fishing boat named the Daisy Gray was gliding slowly through the water just east of the Farallon Islands, when all of a sudden the captain, who's looking straight ahead, he turned the boat and he happened to see straight ahead of him this massive blimp, the same blimp Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams were in, descending very quickly through the clouds down towards the water. And remember, this was a pretty cloudy day, and so really this blimp kind of came out of nowhere, and this fishing boat captain was very aware that anytime blimps were out over the water, that was because they were looking for enemy submarines. And this captain realized he was heading right now straight in the direction of wherever this blimp was descending towards. And so the captain looked out ahead and he saw that big oil slick on top of the water, maybe 100 yards away from him. And so he put it together that, oh my gosh, this blimp is going to that slick. That means there's an enemy submarine basically right there. And so in a panic, the fishing boat captain called to his crew to pull in the fishing nets, and he turned the wheel as fast as he could, and he hit the accelerator, doing everything he could to get away from this blimp. Because he knew that typically what happened when a blimp came down and actually found a submarine is they sometimes dropped bombs on the submarine. I mean, this is warfare. And so the fishing boat captain is getting away as fast as he can, and as soon as he's turned around, he looked back and he saw the blimp was now about 30 feet over the water, and someone inside the gondola was now leaning out over the side, and they dropped two things directly into the water, into that oil slick. And then seconds later, these huge plumes of smoke were coming out of the water. The person had just dropped some flares, basically marking where this submarine was. And so now the captain knew, okay, it's a submarine, and the next thing is very likely going to be a bomb, like a depth charge is going to be dropped right there. And so again, the captain's just speeding his way as fast as he can, hoping that if they do drop a bomb, it doesn't affect him and his crew. And so after making it another couple hundred feet away from this blimp, the captain again turned around, expecting to see this blimp still hovering where it was, because again, they had just dropped flares. They're preparing to do something major right there. But now, when the captain turned around, he saw the blimp was no longer hanging out over the water. The blimp was now rocketing back up into the clouds, like as fast as it possibly could. And before long, the blimp was gone. It disappeared into the clouds. And there had been no bomb dropped. I mean, nothing really happened beyond marking the water. So it was like, what's going on with this blimp? Some of you might know that before I became a professional, strange, dark, and mysterious storyteller, I was in the military. And while I was in the military, I definitely had some pretty wild experiences all around the world. But to be honest, what I remember most about my time in service was not any of my own exploits, but rather it was the insane stories I heard from other service members. Keep in mind, military service members are sent to some of the most isolated, desolate, inhospitable places in the world, and many times in those places, weird things happen. Unexplainable things, like borderline paranormal things happen in these places. Think being out in the middle of the ocean with absolutely nothing around and seeing lights popping up in the sky and coming out of the ocean, and seeing figures up on the mountains wandering around where there shouldn't be any people. I mean, there are insane stories out there from service members, but many of them are not necessarily told in the public. They're kind of kept within the military. It's like kind of part of military lore. And the Wartime Stories YouTube channel that I mentioned at the top of this episode, well, Luke LaManna, the military veteran, he goes out and finds these totally bizarre stories from service members from all over the world, and he tells those stories on his YouTube channel. That is the premise of Wartime Stories. And if that piques your interest, well, you're in luck, because not only can you right now go check out the Wartime Stories YouTube channel, but also, I personally hand-selected Wartime Stories to come under the Ballen Studios umbrella, and we have collaborated to make a brand new weekly podcast, the official Wartime Stories podcast, which is available right now.
So at the end of today's video, I'm going to play the trailer for the Wartime Stories podcast right at the end of this YouTube video. And then after you listen to that, go look up the Wartime Stories podcast on any podcast platform. It's free. All you have to do is look up Ballen Studios and you'll find Wartime Stories that way, or you can direct search for Wartime Stories, click on it, follow them, and give them a listen. It's an amazing weekly show with new episodes coming out every single Monday. It's going to be awesome. Make sure you stick around till the end of this episode to hear that trailer. Okay, back to the story. Meanwhile, back at air control, the last thing they heard from Lieutenant Cody was, hey, we see this oil slick down below, we're going to investigate, and we'll radio back when we're done. And so Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams, they had clearly descended down to the water because that fishing boat saw it happen. But then after they rocketed back up to the clouds for some reason, they never radioed back to air control. And so air control is waiting and waiting. They're not hearing back from Lieutenant Cody or Officer Adams. And finally, they began hailing the two pilots to say, hey, what's going on? You said you were going to investigate. What'd you find? What happened? But they could not get in touch with Lieutenant Cody or Officer Adams. And so eventually, after enough time had passed and they still had not heard from these pilots, air control sent two seaplanes out to that area east of the Farallon Islands to find the blimp and make sure the blimp was okay. But when the seaplanes got out there, they couldn't find the blimp anywhere. I mean, they flew all over the place doing wider and wider circuits. There was no sign of the blimp. And when they looked down at the water in the same area where Lieutenant Cody had called out that slick and where that fishing boat had also seen the slick, well, the slick was gone, or the seaplanes just couldn't see the oil slick. But the seaplanes stayed on station in that area near the Farallon Islands for another 2 hours, just flying all over the place, kind of hoping to eventually see this blimp. And eventually they would. At about 10:30 a.m. that morning, one of the seaplanes spotted the blimp way, way high in the sky, like way higher than any blimp would ever go. It is dangerously high, and it was way off course. But when these two seaplane pilots began flying towards the blimp to get eyes on the pilots inside of this blimp, Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams, well, when they got close enough, the blimp just began rapidly descending, like it was trying to avoid being seen by these seaplanes. And in fact, the blimp descended so quickly that it dropped below the cloud cover, and the seaplanes, they couldn't move that quickly. They had to do a big track to turn back around and try to go lower again. But once they got below the clouds to find this blimp, the blimp was gone. It basically had vanished. And so the seaplane pilots called back to air control, and they're like, I don't know what's going on with this blimp, but it's way off course. It was way up in the sky. Now it's somewhere down below, but we can't find it. We got to get in touch with Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams. There's obviously something wrong. But air control would try over and over again to get in touch with these pilots, but neither Cody nor Adams ever responded. They had just gone totally radio silent. And at the same time this chaos with this blimp is happening, Ida Ruby, the woman at the beginning of the story, was riding her horse on that dirt path near the beach just south of San Francisco, and she looked out over the water and she saw that blimp. And so Ida Ruby, she stops, she raises her binoculars, and she looks at this blimp. And after she focuses her binoculars, she realizes there's obviously something wrong with this blimp. The actual balloon portion of the blimp, which said Navy on it, had collapsed so much in the middle that you couldn't even read the word Navy. It was all crumpled together because, again, the balloon is like deflated. And also she saw that this blimp appeared to just be kind of listing as if the wind was blowing it and it was not being directed by the pilots inside. And this blimp appeared to be getting blown directly towards Ida. And so she lowered her binoculars and she looked out with her naked eye, and sure enough, this crumpled up blimp that was still afloat, but clearly was not doing too well, was getting closer and closer and closer to her. And as it was getting lower and lower to the ground, and she's starting to worry it's going to smash into her. But right as this blimp was about to pass basically right over her head, she raised her binoculars one more time and she got a clear look inside of the gondola where Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams would have been. Now, Ida Ruby has no idea who's supposed to be inside of this blimp and who isn't, or even what they're doing, but she definitely recalled exactly what she saw inside of that gondola, and that's the thing that has troubled everybody for so many years, because what she saw was 3 people inside of that gondola. And if you recall, that gondola only ever contained 2 people. It was Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams. But now, Ida Ruby is looking up, and clear as day,
there are 3 people in that gondola. Even though at no point was there 3 people. It didn't leave with 3. It didn't come down and take more people on board. It made no sense that there were 3 people inside of that gondola. Again, Ida Ruby wouldn't have known that, but when that information got passed, this was like, how could that be? And so after seeing the 3 men inside of this blimp, Ida lowered her binoculars and watched in horror as this deflated blimp drifted just above her, like practically arm's length above her, and careened over the cliffs behind her and smashed into the ground. And then seconds later, Ida began hearing sirens going off in Daly City, which was located right behind her. That was the nearest town. And so as the blimp came in for a crash landing in Daly City, it scraped across a couple of residential rooftops and hit a couple power lines before kind of coming to a stop in the middle of the street. Now, the blimp didn't explode or catch on fire or anything. It just kind of crumpled to the ground and nobody got out of it. It just kind of stopped and it was there right in the middle of the street. And very quickly, first responders rushed to this blimp because there have been so many reports of this deflated blimp looking like it was about to crash. And so they had been tracking it, and here it was. And so they ran up to this blimp. But at some point, one of the first responders ran up to the gondola itself where the door was slightly open, and they opened it up, hoping to find there would be some survivors inside. But when he looked inside of this relatively small space, there was nobody in there. And there was no sign that anybody had been in there. There was no blood or anything. It was just an empty gondola. But remember, minutes before, not even, Ida Ruby had clearly seen 3 people inside of that gondola. So to go from 3 people to none in the space of a couple hundred feet as everybody's watching this thing come into crash land in Daly City, where could they have gone? And even weirder was when they looked inside of the gondola, they discovered that basically everything was functioning perfectly fine. It was unclear how it became deflated because, again, all the controls inside of this thing were working just fine. And also, the parachutes were still inside of this gondola. If you're going to jump out, you need a parachute, but they were in here. And also the life raft, it was still inside of the gondola. It was like there was nothing wrong with the blimp. And so this whole situation made no sense. The Navy would launch an exhaustive investigation into what happened with this blimp. And the only explanation the Navy came up with was, well, it looks like Officer Adams and Lieutenant Cody just fell out of the blimp at the exact same time and they disappeared into the ocean. However, both pilots were wearing life preservers and would not have taken those off. That was absolutely 101 for being a pilot of one of these blimps. And so they would have had these life preservers on, and even if they had fallen out and perished, they would have floated to the surface, or if they landed on land, they would have likely been found. I mean, the entire route they had been on was heavily scrutinized and searched, but the bodies were never found. And then also, the Navy could not explain how Ida Ruby clearly saw 3 people absolutely, 100 feet away from her, inside of that gondola. She had no reason to lie about that. She was just saying, yeah, I looked up, saw 3 people, saw it crash into Daly City. She didn't know there was supposed to be 2 people. She was just calling what she saw. But the Navy had no explanation. And so in the years that have followed this empty blimp crash in Daly City, it's been dubbed the ghost blimp story, and loads of theories circulate about what could have happened here. Some people say that, the reason there was all that extra weight at the beginning of the mission profile at 6 a.m. was not because of moisture on the balloon, but because there had to have been maybe a stowaway somewhere in the blimp, and then after takeoff, they jumped down into the gondola, and maybe they were responsible for whatever happened to the pilots and why the blimp crashed. But it doesn't explain what happened to those 3 people. What happened to the stowaway? What happened to Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams' body? We don't know. Other theories include that maybe Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams were somehow captured by the Japanese, and some other people say, maybe Cody and Adams were abducted by aliens. But as far-fetched as these theories might seem, the truth is, we really have no idea what happened on that ghost blimp. Okay, that's the end of today's story. And now here is the official trailer for the Wartime Stories podcast. And after you listen to it, be sure to go find the Wartime Stories podcast on any podcast platform, give them a follow, and tune in every Monday for a brand new episode. Enjoy the trailer.
What kind of stories come to mind when you hear the term war? Stories of courage under fire, daring accounts of espionage, or despicable crimes against humanity. True, these are stories which no doubt permeate the forefront of our minds when it comes to war. But in and amongst the many anecdotes and legends born out of military service, from the gruesome front lines in foreign lands to the peacetime garrison back on home soil, did you know that there were other kinds of stories? The kinds of stories that are whispered, ever so quietly, among the disciplined ranks of military personnel. Experiences that often go unreported because, well, who among their commanding officers would believe them? Stories of unexplained mysteries, of terrifying creatures that hide deep in unexplored regions, encounters with entities that were thought to exist only in legends, testimonies that indicate we are not alone in the universe, and supernatural encounters that make a man question the nature of life and death.
Who said that?
My name is Luke LaManna. I'm a Marine Corps reconnaissance veteran with a few strange experiences. And when I became a civilian again, I found myself going down the proverbial rabbit hole. I became obsessed with finding these kinds of stories and getting to the root of them. And now, I'm going to share them with you. From Ballen Studios, this is Wartime Stories, a new, immersive weekly podcast that is a mix of horror, mystery, and awe-inspiring tales, where the strange, dark, and mysterious meets the battlefield and beyond. Follow and listen to Wartime Stories now, wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes every Monday.
Hundreds of people go missing under baffling conditions in the woods of North America every year. I'm talking about people that are right in front of their loved ones and then in an instant they're just gone. Or in other cases, people disappear and then are found again in places that are seemingly impossible to get to. One former police detective named David Paulides has investigated thousands of these strange disappearances, and he documents what he finds in his incredible book series called Missing 411. Today, we're going to take a look at 3 missing 411 cases that even amongst strange disappearances, these rank as particularly bizarre. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please send a memo around to the entire office giving everybody a paid afternoon off, except for the like button. Tell them they have to stay back and mind the phones. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On June 23, 1963, 7-year-old Bruce Farron, along with his aunt, uncle, and cousins, began the 2-mile hike into the Uinta mountain range in Utah. They were headed for Pyramid Lake, where they planned to do some camping for a couple of days. After they arrived, they decided they would head down to the water to cool off. But right before they got in the water, Bruce told his aunt and uncle that he needed to use the bathroom. And so his family got into the water, and Bruce walked over to a grove of trees and bushes to relieve himself. After a couple of minutes, Bruce did not come out of the wood line, and so his aunt and uncle started yelling for him. He didn't come out again, and so the uncle walked up and walked into the trees to go find his nephew, but he was not there. And so his uncle starts yelling for his nephew, but he's nowhere to be found. And so he yelled back for his wife and his kids to come help him look. And for the next hour, they searched the entire area yelling for Bruce, but there was no sign of him. So they contacted the authorities. That day, a huge search was launched for Bruce, but just like his family, nobody could find any trace of him. The following day at 4 p.m., Bruce had still not been located. And at this point, his family is starting to lose hope. And it was around that time that a searcher who was several miles away from where Bruce had last been seen was walking up this very steep trail heading up towards this cliff. And the searcher knew this cliff was 500 feet and there was no way a child could climb up it or down it. And so he was about to turn around and go search somewhere else when he happened to look up and he saw a child walking down the trail towards him, and the child was Bruce. And Bruce was totally fine, albeit a little bit hungry. According to David Paulides, all of these search and rescue models that predict where missing people will end up after they go missing say that boys aged 7 to 9 will be found within a 7.2 mile radius 95% of the time, and that distance could be covered over a week's time. In order for Bruce to be found where he would have needed to cover 20 miles along a rugged ridgeline before scaling down that 500-foot cliff without the aid of climbing gear, and he did all that within 30 hours, a seemingly impossible task for a missing 7-year-old boy. When asked what happened, Bruce said he didn't remember. He didn't understand why or how he had gotten lost in the first place. The only things he remembered were sleeping between 2 downed logs and drinking from a waterfall and many animals, including one that was so close to him at night that it would jump over him. Bruce was followed up with as he got older, but he never could regain the memory of what actually happened to him. Some have speculated that Bruce might have been abducted when he went to the bathroom, and that's the only way he was able to cover that great of a distance in that amount of time, that his abductor basically physically moved him at least part of the way, and that perhaps his abductor was one of these animals he saw at night. In 2007, Barbara Bullock was a 55-year-old, fit, happy, healthy woman living in Montana with her husband of 14 years. In July of that year, her husband's cousin named Donna and Donna's boyfriend named Jim Rawmaker came to stay with them for a couple of days. On the evening of the 17th, Barbara offered to take the couple hiking with her the following morning at her favorite hiking spot, which was this totally unspoiled wilderness area on the border of Idaho. Barbara liked to hike a particular trail that brought her up to the Bear Creek overlook that had this incredible view down to the valley below. The couple happily agreed, but the following morning, Donna was not feeling so good, so she couldn't go on the hike. But her boyfriend, Jim, was still feeling up for it and said, I'd still like to go. And so he and Barbara wound up doing the hike on their own. At 1:30 that afternoon, Barbara's husband got a phone call from a police officer saying his wife was missing. And her husband just couldn't understand that. Barbara hiked in that area all the time, and she had been with Jim, so where could she have gone? But the police officer didn't have a great answer, and he just told him, you should come down here and hear Jim's explanation about what happened. When Barbara's husband arrived at the park, he rolled right up next to the officer and Jim. He got out, and Jim, who was in total shock, began to explain what happened. He and Barbara had made it up the trail successfully to the Bear Creek overlook. They'd stayed up there for about 30 minutes. They had a picnic, and they were enjoying the scenery. And then at the end of it, they packed up, and Barbara began walking down the very well-marked trail, and she was about 20 feet ahead of him when he decided to turn around and take one more look at the beautiful view. And he said he was looking at the view for about 40 seconds before he turned back around and Barbara was gone. And he hadn't heard her call out for help. He hadn't heard her fall. There was no sound of other people. There was no sound of other animals. There was no sound of any struggle whatsoever. It was just complete eerie silence. And as he took a few steps down the trail, he said he started looking around, expecting to just see her behind a tree or something, but she was nowhere. And as he walked, he noticed that the ground underneath every step made a lot of noise because there was lots of loose rocks and shale all over the ground. And so he stopped and he's listening really intently to see if he can hear where Barbara's gone, but he doesn't hear anything. And he's thinking, how could she have gotten away from me without me hearing the sound of her footsteps? And then he also began looking around and realized the area they were in, this trail, it was well trafficked. And so it was not very densely forested. You could actually see a pretty good distance in all directions because there was enough space between the trees. And so he's looking around thinking there's almost nowhere to hide. And so Jim started to feel scared and just began walking down the trail, expecting to run into her at any moment. But he didn't, and he kept turning around and looking behind trees and rocks, and he's thinking, this is impossible. I should have seen her. I should see her now. Where could she have possibly gone? And so he made his way all the way down the trail, the whole time turning around and looking for her and yelling for her, but never getting any feedback from her. And he got all the way to the parking lot, and he saw her car was still parked in the parking lot. And he's looking around the parking lot. She's not out there. And he noticed a crew was working in the road. And he went up to them and he asked if they had seen her or anybody come out of that trail. And they said no. And so Jim's starting to panic, and he ran right back up the trail, all the way back up to the Bear Creek overlook, hoping that along the way he would see some indication of where she went. But again, there was nothing on the trail. He gets up to the overlook, he's looking around, he's yelling for her, nothing. And so he ran right back down again and he contacted authorities. Over the next 48 hours, a huge search was launched all around this area for Barbara. It included helicopters and huge search teams and highly trained sniffing dogs, but nothing was found. There was no signs of foul play. There was no signs of an animal attack or some sort of abduction. There was nothing. Not even her scent was found, despite the fact that the dog's handlers knew exactly where her last position was. But none of the dogs picked it up, which is highly unusual. It really was like she had vanished into thin air. At first, Jim was obviously a suspect because he was the last person to see Barbara alive, but he never changed his story despite how far-fetched it seemed, and he was very cooperative and was very quick to offer to take a polygraph test, and so the police ruled him out as a suspect. And shortly after the search started, they shut it down because there was no sign of this woman anywhere. And so unfortunately, her family had to face the awful reality of getting zero closure. She was just gone and nobody knew what happened. And unfortunately, to this day, we still don't know what happened because no trace of Barbara has ever been found. In 1910, 23-year-old Orville Tuttle worked as a locomotive engineer in Whitehall, Montana. While he loved his job and loved cars, his real passion was hunting. His friends would describe him as being a fearless hunter, a crack shot, and very cool under pressure. In October of that year, Orville, along with his younger brother and his cousin, headed off to a river valley just outside of Yellowstone National Park to do some hunting. When they got there, they made their way into the forest, they found a decent clearing, they brushed off some snow, and they set up their campsite. They stayed up for a bit around the campfire that night, but everybody went to bed early. The following morning, Orville was the first one to wake up, and while he was outside of the campsite, he noticed some elk tracks that had passed by in the night. And so he woke up his brother and cousin and told them he was going to go and track this animal for no longer than about an hour. The two men said that was fine. They knew Orville was a very accomplished outdoorsman, and so they weren't worried about him. An hour later, the brother and the cousin were now awake, and they were sitting around the fire waiting for Orville to return, but he didn't. The men waited another hour, and another hour, and another hour, and still Orville never showed up. And this whole time, the men are considering, should we go out and go looking for him? And every time they'd stand up to go begin their search, they'd say, you know what? I'm sure he's fine. We're overreacting. And they'd sit back down again. But by nightfall, when they still had not seen Orville or heard from him, the pair was starting to get really nervous. And so they decided they would go to bed, and Orville was bound to turn up in the middle of the night. Early the next morning, the two men got up, hoping to see Orville, but he had not returned. And so the two men left the forest. They got two more family members to come back with them, and then the four of them began a search for Orville. And very quickly, they found Orville's tracks leading out of the camp, meandering their way through this very thick forest and through all the snow, all the way down to this very shallow river that at its deepest point was no higher than your ankle. Orville's tracks stopped at the edge of this river and continued for 3 miles, walking away from the campsite right alongside this river until they stopped in this little clearing in the snow where there was a very small campfire set up. But the logs and the kindling in the campfire had not been burned. And so the search party figured that Orville, when he got here, must have had wet matches or something because he couldn't get the fire going. And then from the campfire, they continued to follow Orville's tracks a little bit farther down the river until they turned and walked directly into this very shallow river. And then from there, the search party looked for miles and miles and miles downstream and upstream, and they never found any tracks leaving the river, even though alongside the entire river on both sides was plenty of snow. So anybody who walked into the river and then walked out again would leave tracks. But there were no more tracks. As it started to get dark and they still had not found any sign of Orville, one of the men left the forest and contacted authorities, who launched a formal search. The sheriff's department, along with hundreds of volunteers, descended into this area where Orville got lost, and they started by searching even farther downstream and upstream of this river to see if they could find where Orville stepped out of the river, but they too couldn't find any tracks. And so for a couple of days, they searched this river and the surrounding forests, but there was just no sign of Orville. Then on the third evening of this search, one of the searchers was up in the mountains in an area that was relatively close to the last area where Orville had tracks in the snow. And the searcher saw there was a little campfire that had been set up in the middle of nowhere. He walked up to it and he saw it had been recently extinguished. It was still warm, and next to this fire was a pair of boots.
but there was no person anywhere in the vicinity. And then the searcher noticed there were tracks leaving this campfire, and these tracks were made with bare feet. And so the searcher just began following these tracks. And so the searcher went up a mountain, he went down the other side, down into this deep ravine, and then he stopped because he's looking straight ahead of him, and it's another mountain going straight up, and that's where the tracks continue to go. And it's very thickly forested, and it's starting to get dark, and so he's thinking to himself, is it a good idea to just continue walking on my own, or should I go back and get some help? And so as he's weighing out what he should do next, he catches movement out of his peripheral vision, and he kind of glances up into the mountain right ahead of him, and he sees this dark figure kind of slowly moving up the mountain quite a ways away from him. But from his perspective, even though he doesn't have a good view, it looks like a man. And so if it's a man walking up this hill, it's probably the same guy that left that campfire and therefore is leaving these barefoot tracks up this mountain. And so the searcher thinks that's gotta be Orville. Something's wrong with him. Who knows what's going on with him, but I gotta get his attention. And so the searcher yells out to this guy to try to get him to stop. But even though he was clearly in earshot, this guy just did not stop moving. He just methodically continued moving up the mountain. And so the searcher's confused at why this person wouldn't stop. And so he pulls out his pistol and fires 3 shots into the air, which is like the universal stop what you're doing and turn around. But again, this figure, this person, this guy didn't stop. They didn't react, no flinching. They just kept moving up and over the top of the mountain and out of sight. And so now the searcher's thinking to himself, what did I just see? Who is that? What were they doing out here? And he's thinking, you know what? It's too dark. I can't just continue up this mountain towards whoever this is. I got to go back. And so the searcher marked where he was, turned around, and he ran back to the search party, and he told them what he had seen. And they said, okay, well, we'll go looking tomorrow. And so the next morning early, this huge search party gets to that ravine where he marked that spot. But at this point, so much snow had fallen, all the tracks of this barefoot man who was walking around the night before have all been covered up. And so despite doing a very extensive search with a lot of people in that area, they couldn't find any trace of this shoeless man. Many believe the shoeless man was Orville. And in fact, the local newspapers at the time speculated as much. But if it was Orville, why didn't he turn around when someone was yelling his name or when multiple gunshots were fired into the air? And where was he going walking barefoot in a snowstorm in the middle of the night? Others have speculated this was not Orville, that it was some other person or some other creature lurking around the woods at night, and that perhaps they had something to do with whatever happened to Orville. But regardless of who or what that figure was, no one ever found any traces of Orville or the shoeless man ever again. So that's going to do it, guys. If you want to learn more about the missing 411 phenomenon, I would encourage you to check out the official YouTube page of Missing 411. It's called the Can-Am Missing Project. That's David Pilatus' official and only YouTube page. I would also encourage you to go to canammissing.com, where you can purchase all of the Missing 411 books, as well as check out their documentaries, and all this information is linked in the description below. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok, where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts, where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.